The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest in the heart of the Ozark Mountains. It was old, with peeling paint and creaky wooden steps, but it had charm. A rustic getaway, far from the noise of daily life. The autumn sun bathed the world in hues of gold and red, its rays slicing through the trees and glinting off the small stream that wound its way through the property. The air smelled of earth and decaying leaves, a scent that felt both comforting and faintly ominous. I had driven down with 3 friends, Mark, Ellie, and Travis, and my dog, Max, a wiry brown mutt with floppy ears and boundless energy. We were looking forward to a weekend of hiking, fishing, and nights by the fire. It had been Mark's idea to rent the place. "It's remote," he'd said with a grin. "No cell service, no distractions." I wasn't sure if that was a selling point or a warning. We arrived in the early afternoon, unloading supplies and settling in. I took a moment to look around the place, noting the thick woods that seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides. There was something about the way the shadows shifted between the trees, like they were alive and watching. I shook the thought from my mind. I was a postman, used to walking long stretches alone, and I'd always been good at brushing off strange feelings. By evening, we had a fire going in the stone pit out back. The flames crackled, and the scent of burning wood mixed with the crisp autumn air. Max lay near my feet, gnawing on a stick he'd found. Ellie was telling a story about some haunted house she'd visited as a kid, her voice rising and falling theatrically. We laughed, though the woods around us seemed quieter than they should have been. That was when Max perked up, his ears twitching. He stood, letting out a low growl that sent a chill up my spine. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, my voice too loud in the stillness. Max didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the tree line, his body tense. The others fell silent, following his stare. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, a shadow shifted, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, blending with the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and a face I couldn't quite make out. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes on us, heavy and invasive. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered. No one answered. The figure stepped back into the darkness, disappearing without a sound. Max barked, a sharp, frantic noise that shattered the silence. I grabbed him by the collar, my heart pounding. Ellie clutched Travis's arm, her face pale. "We should go inside," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. Once inside, we bolted the doors and drew the curtains. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a hunter or a trick of the light, but none of us believed him. I'd seen something like this before, on a TV show about skinwalkers. Creatures from Navajo lore, they could mimic voices, take on shapes, and lure people into the woods. I'd thought it was just a story, but now... The night wore on, the fire in the hearth crackling softly. None of us slept. Every so often, Max would growl, staring at the door as if something was just on the other side. Around midnight, we heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Travis grabbed a hunting knife from his bag, and I took a flashlight, gripping it tightly. Ellie sat frozen on the couch, her eyes wide. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. It came from the back door. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. "Grab what you can," I hissed. "We're leaving." We slipped out the front, moving as quietly as possible. The moon cast a faint light over the woods, but the shadows were deep, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Max stayed close, his tail low and his ears pinned back. We didn't make it far before we heard it again, the scraping, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It was close, too close. "Run," I whispered, and we did. The woods were a maze, branches snagging at our clothes and roots, threatening to trip us. Max barked once, then fell silent, as if he knew noise would give us away. I could hear the creature behind us, its movements impossibly fast, its growls growing louder. Ellie tripped, letting out a sharp cry. I doubled back, pulling her to her feet as Travis and Mark kept moving. The creature was closer now. I could feel it, a heavy presence pressing down on us. "Go," Ellie urged, but I didn't let go of her arm. We pushed forward, hearts hammering, until the woods thinned and the outline of a small road came into view. Mark and Travis were already there, waving frantically at a car that had stopped. We piled in, breathless and shaking. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, looked at us like we were crazy. "What's going on?" he asked. "Just drive," I said, my voice hoarse. He didn't argue. As we sped away, I glanced back at the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw it. A tall, lad's dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go. Then it was gone. We didn't call the police. What would we say? That a creature from legend had chased us through the woods? We left the cabin as it was, our things still inside. No one wanted to go back. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. The way it moved, the sound it made, the way it seemed to enjoy the fear it caused. I don't know what it was, but I do know this. I'm never going back to the Ozarks. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods of Maine, far enough off the beaten path that it didn't even show up on most maps. It belonged to a friend of mine who swore by its solitude. "You'll have peace and quiet," he'd said. The perfect getaway. It sounded ideal after weeks of overtime and late nights. I packed up my truck, threw in my tools, some basic supplies, and a bag of dog food for Rex, my black Labrador with a white patch on his chest, and set off. The drive up was uneventful but long, winding through small towns with old general stores and weathered signs. As the truck climbed higher into the woods, patches of snow began to appear. It was early spring, but winter wasn't done with this part of the world yet. Snow dusted the ground like powdered sugar, and the air had that crisp, sharp bite that made you glad for a warm coat. When I finally reached the cabin, it was everything I'd hoped for. Rustic but sturdy, with a porch overlooking a frozen stream. The trees around it were dense, their bare branches stark against the gray sky. Rex leaped out of the truck, his paws crunching in the snow as he sniffed around, his tail wagging furiously. I let him explore while I unloaded, the sound of his barks and the crunch of my boots the only noises for miles. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it chopping wood and setting up inside. The cabin was cold but well insulated, and the small wood stove in the corner radiated enough heat to make it cozy. Rex curled up near the fire, content after a hearty meal. I sat at the table with a book I'd been meaning to read, the quiet wrapping around me like a blanket. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire again, sipping coffee, when Rex perked up. His ears stood straight, and he let out a low growl that rumbled in his chest. He stared at the door, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" I asked, setting my mug down. Rex didn't move, his growl growing louder. I stood and grabbed the flashlight from the table, my heart beating a little faster. Opening the door, I shone the beam out into the darkness. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, catching the light like tiny diamonds. At first, I saw nothing, just the trees and the faint glow of the moon. Then a sound, a faint rustling like something moving through the underbrush. "Probably a deer," I muttered, though my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Rex didn't seem convinced. He barked, sharp and loud, his tail stiff. That was when I saw it. A shadow just beyond the edge of the light, too tall and thin to be a deer. It moved quickly, darting between the trees with an unnatural grace. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door and locked it, my breath coming fast. Rex barked again, pacing by the door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, an animal, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I'd read stories in those yellowed tabloids you find at gas stations, the ones with headlines about skinwalkers and other creatures of legend. They always seemed ridiculous at the time, but now... The rest of the night was a blur of tension. I didn't sleep, my ears straining for every creak and rustle. Rex stayed close, his body pressed against my legs. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall outside. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my hunting knife and the flashlight, my hands shaking. Rex growled low, his hackles raised. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft, almost human whisper. It was faint, but it was there, circling the cabin like the wind. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I packed up quickly, keeping the knife within reach, in which Rex seemed equally eager to go, his tail down as he stuck close to my side. We headed for the truck, but as we approached, I saw something that made me freeze. Tracks in the snow, too large and oddly shaped to be human, circled the cabin and led off into the woods. My stomach churned. Whatever it was, it had been watching us all night. We drove down the mountain in tense silence, the tires crunching over the snow-covered road. I called my brother when we hit a spot with service, just to hear a familiar voice. I didn't tell him what had happened, though. What could I say? That I'd been stalked by something out of legend? Even now, back in Austin, the memory lingers. I can't stop thinking about the shadow in the trees, the whispers, and those tracks. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was something else. Either way, I'm not going back to that cabin. We didn't expect Maine to feel so isolated. The rolling, forested hills seemed to stretch on forever, and the trails wound through places that felt untouched by time. I came with 3 friends, Ben, Carly, and Travis, for a long hike through a stretch of land near Baxter State Park. Spring had just begun to nudge the world awake, but patches of snow still lingered in shady spots, melting into rivulets that trickled down the hillsides. Our first day was perfect. We hiked through towering pines, the air crisp and cool, our boots crunching over soft patches of earth. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind of cloudy that made you keep an eye on the horizon, wondering if rain might sneak in. But it never did. By the time we set up camp that evening, we were exhausted, laughing over small things as we cooked over a fire. I hadn't felt this relaxed in ages. Mississippi doesn't have places like this. Back home, I'm used to flat stretches of farmland and humid air that clings to your skin. Here, the air felt clean, sharp even. As a cook, I rarely get time away from the chaos of the kitchen, so this trip was a chance to breathe. I thought about my brother, Jacob, who'd taught me how to hunt. He'd probably love a place like this. The trouble began the next day. We'd gone deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing until it was more of a suggestion than a path. It felt thrilling, like we were truly away from the world. Travis had been pushing for us to try a new route he'd found on some online forum. A less traveled path, he said. That should have been the first red flag, but none of us thought twice about it. We came across strange things as we walked. At first, it was little details that seemed off. Broken branches on trees too high for animals to reach, claw marks in the bark that were too deep to belong to anything I could name. Carly joked that it was probably a bear. But as we pressed on, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded until only the crunch of our boots filled the silence. It wasn't until late afternoon that we saw it. We were resting near a small clearing, passing around a water bottle when Ben stiffened. He pointed toward the edge of the trees. "Do you see that?" At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved, shifting slightly behind a tree. It was tall, much too tall and unnaturally thin. My stomach knotted as I stared. The thing's shape was wrong, almost human, but not quite. It stayed still, watching us, its head tilting slightly like it was trying to figure us out. "Is that someone?" Carly whispered. None of us answered. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words caught in my throat. Travis reached for the hunting knife on his belt, his movements slow and deliberate. The shadow didn't move, but I swear I felt its gaze on me, cold and piercing. Then, it darted away. Not like an animal, not even like a person. It moved too fast, too smooth, vanishing into the trees without a sound. We didn't talk about it right away. We just packed up and started moving, our nerves frayed. The sun was beginning to dip, and none of us wanted to be in the woods after dark. But the feeling of being watched stayed with us, an invisible weight pressing down. That night, we made camp earlier than usual, setting up near a cluster of boulders that felt like a barrier. The fire crackled as we sat close, our voices subdued. Travis was sharpening his knife, Carly fidgeted with her flashlight, and Ben kept glancing over his shoulder. I stared into the flames. trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Then the sound came. It was faint at first, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. Rex, my old dog, used to growl like that when he sensed danger, but this was deeper, almost a rumble, circling us from the shadows. We froze, our eyes darting toward the darkened trees. The next moment was chaos. The thing slammed into one of the boulders with enough force to shake the ground, its shape barely visible in the firelight. It was close now, too close, its limbs long and unnatural as it prowled just out of reach. Travis yelled, brandishing his knife, but the creature didn't back off. It moved in a slow, deliberate circle, its eyes glowing faintly in the flickering light. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Carly's arm. We didn't put the fire out. There was no time. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind us. It was faster than us, but it seemed to toy with us, staying just far enough back to keep us moving. We hid in a thicket, pressing ourselves into the damp earth, our breaths ragged. The creature prowled nearby, its shadowy form visible through the gaps in the branches. We stayed silent, barely daring to breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give us away. When it finally moved on, we didn't waste time. We crept through the forest as quietly as we could, the cloudy sky making it hard to see. Ben tripped once, and I thought we were done for, but somehow, the creature didn't come back. We called my friend Sam when we finally reached a main road, our bodies trembling from the cold and adrenaline. Sam picked us up, his truck feeling like a sanctuary. We didn't tell him everything, just that we'd gotten lost and spooked by an animal. But the look in his eyes told me he knew there was more to it. Even now, I can't explain what we saw. I've tried to convince myself it was just a bear or a trick of the light, but the memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of its growl won't leave me. I don't think it ever will. The humid air of Bladenboro hung thick as we pulled our gear from the truck. Summer in North Carolina had a way of draping you in its heat, the kind that clings to your skin and makes even breathing feel like an effort. But we didn't mind. The four of us, me, Kevin, Tanya, and Marcus, had planned this fishing trip for months, and nothing was going to ruin it. The Black River ran through this part of the state, its lazy current winding past dense forest that seemed to hum with life. The town had a sleepy charm to it, but the woods felt alive. Being from Chicago, I wasn't used to places like this. Back home, it's all concrete and steel, the constant hum of traffic, the grind of machines. My job as a lumberjack kept me outdoors, but it was nothing like this. Here, the air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. It reminded me of trips with my uncle when I was a kid. He'd take me out to Lake Michigan, and we'd spend hours fishing, barely talking, but feeling the bond grow stronger with each cast of the line. The plan was simple: fish all day, camp near the river, and head back in the morning. Kevin had picked the spot, a clearing by the water that was supposedly great for bass. The hike in had been uneventful, the trail well-worn and shaded by towering oaks. We reached the clearing just as the sky began to cloud over, the sun turning pale and weak behind a layer of gray. As night fell, we built a fire and settled in. Tanya and Marcus cooked while Kevin and I prepped the fishing gear. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced among the trees. I found myself staring into the dark, the flickering light playing tricks on my eyes. It was then I remembered an article I'd read a few weeks back in a fringe magazine. It had talked about strange sightings in North Carolina, something people called the Dogman. Half man, half beast, it was said to stalk the woods, preying on those who wandered too far from safety. I dismissed it as folklore, the kind of thing meant to scare campers and sell magazines. But now, in the middle of these woods, the story gnawed at the edges of my mind. The first sign of trouble came with the silence. One moment, the forest was alive with the sounds of insects and night birds, and the next, it was dead quiet. Even the crackle of the fire seemed muted. Kevin noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. "You hear that?" he asked. Or don't hear, Tanya muttered, her voice low. Something moved in the shadows. A branch snapped, loud and sharp, and we all turned toward the sound. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I saw it, or part of it, a shape, low and sleek, prowling just beyond the firelight. It moved like a predator, its body hunched and deliberate. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, gripping the handle of the hatchet he always carried. The figure paused, its outline barely visible against the dark, and then it rose. It stood on two legs, its form unnaturally tall, its shoulders broad and hunched. The firelight caught its eyes, yellow, reflective, and far too intelligent for any animal I'd ever seen. A low growl rumbled from its throat, deep and resonant, vibrating in my chest. None of us moved, none of us even breathed. The creature took a step closer, its movements fluid, almost human, but not quite. The smell hit me next, something acrid and metallic, like blood and decay. "Back up," I hissed, my voice barely audible, slowly. We inched away from the fire, our eyes never leaving the thing. It watched us, its head tilting slightly, as if deciding what to do next, and then it lunged. The attack was sudden and brutal. It slammed into the fire, scattering embers and sending a shower of sparks into the air. We ran, our boots pounding against the earth, the creature's guttural snarls echoing behind us. Kevin shouted something, but I couldn't make it out. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail. By then, Tanya was limping, her face pale. The creature had slashed at her leg as we fled, leaving 3 deep gashes that oozed blood. Marcus and I supported her as we stumbled down the path, our breaths ragged and desperate. Somehow, we made it to the road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and we waved frantically, shouting for help. The car stopped, a pickup driven by an older man with a face lined by years of hard living. He didn't ask questions, just helped us into the truck and sped off, his eyes darting toward the dark forest as if he knew. We called my sister once we reached town. I didn't tell her everything, just that we'd been attacked by an animal and needed to get Tanya to a hospital. But as I sat in the waiting room, replaying the night in my mind, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I'd never forget it. Even now, the memory haunts me. The way it moved, the way it watched us. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something older and far more dangerous. And it's still out there, prowling the woods of Bladenboro, waiting for its next prey. Spring in New York's Hudson Valley is a beautiful thing. The trees are waking up, their leaves still bright green and tender. The air carries that damp, earthy smell, a promise of life returning after the cold grip of winter. I had planned this hike with my friends, Chris, Megan, and Taylor, months ago. It was supposed to be a way to escape our routines, shake off the winter blues, and maybe catch some great views. We all needed it. I grew up in Poughkeepsie, a town sandwiched between the Catskill Mountains and the Hudson River. As a gardener, I'm no stranger to long days outdoors, my hands caked in dirt, the sun beating down. But this trip wasn't about work. It was about reconnecting with nature, maybe even finding some peace. I packed light, but I made sure to bring a sturdy knife, something my dad always said you should have in the woods. We parked at the trailhead just as the sun crept high in the sky, its golden light cutting through the morning mist. The path weaved through the woods, the forest alive with the sound of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. We joked and laughed, the kind of easy banter that comes from years of friendship. I didn't think about the stories I'd watched on YouTube, the ones about skinwalkers, until later. At that moment, it was just us and the trail. We reached the clearing we'd chosen as our campsite by late afternoon. The spot was perfect. A flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines with a view of a distant ridge. The sun was still shining, but the forest was already cooling down. We set up our tents and got a fire going. As the flames crackled and the sun dipped lower, the forest seemed to draw in closer, its shadows longer and darker. It started subtly, the way these things always do. Megan was the first to notice. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper. We all stopped talking, our laughter dying as we strained to listen. The woods had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of our own breathing. Chris tried to brush it off, saying it was normal for animals to quiet down at night. But there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then we heard it, a rustle, faint but deliberate, coming from the trees behind our campsite. We all froze, staring into the darkness. Probably a deer, Taylor said, but his voice lacked conviction. Deer don't spy on you, Megan shot back. I squinted into the shadows, my hand instinctively going to my knife. There was something there, something just beyond the firelight. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. It was watching us. We decided to stick close to the fire, the light and warmth a small comfort against the encroaching night. The sounds continued, faint movements in the trees, like something circling us. I thought about those videos I'd watched, the ones about creatures that could mimic voices and appearances, creatures that fed on fear. I hadn't believed them then. I wasn't so sure now. As the night dragged on, the thing in the woods grew bolder. A low, guttural sound, a growl maybe, drifted from the darkness. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a chill through all of us. Then came the snap of a branch, closer this time. Okay, what the hell is that? Chris said, standing and gripping a large branch he'd pulled from the firewood pile. None of us had an answer. We huddled closer, our backs to the fire, our eyes scanning the trees. The thing stayed hidden, its presence more felt than seen. It was toying with us, letting us know it was there without fully revealing itself. We decided we couldn't just sit and wait. We packed quickly, the fire still burning as we grabbed what we could carry and started down the trail. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, and our flashlights cast weak beams that seemed to make the shadows deeper. The creature followed us. It stayed just out of sight, but its presence was undeniable. Every so often we'd hear its steps, deliberate heavy, and the occasional low growl. Megan stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the ground. I helped her up, my heart pounding as I glanced over my shoulder. For a split second, I thought I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its eyes reflecting the faint light like a predator's. Then it was gone. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the woods, the small village of Ashford just visible through the trees. My legs burned and my lungs ached, but we kept moving, the creature's presence driving us forward. When we finally reached the safety of the village, I called my brother. I didn't tell him everything, just that we'd been spooked by something in the woods. He offered to drive out and pick us up, and we waited in the small diner that was still open, the fluorescent lights, a harsh contrast to the soft, natural glow of the fire we'd left behind. As I sit here now, replaying everything in my mind, I can't shake the feeling that we were lucky to make it out. I don't know what was in those woods, but I know it wasn't human, and I know it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far into its territory. The rain was falling in a steady rhythm, soaking the ground and pattering against the dense canopy of trees above us. Spring in Maine could be unpredictable, but the crisp air and the promise of fresh game had drawn us into the wilderness anyway. Our hunting trip was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to unplug from the world and immerse ourselves in nature. Instead, it turned into something I'll never forget, and not for the reasons I'd hoped. There were 4 of us. Me, Chuck Rambo, and my friends. Dave, a contractor from Boston, Sarah, an EMT who had a knack for storytelling, and Benny, a retired teacher with a dry sense of humor. I grew up in New Orleans, where the swamps and bayous taught me to respect the wild. Hiking had always been my escape, a way to clear my mind after long days as a mechanic. But the Maine woods were something else entirely. The trees here stood tall and ancient, their branches intertwining like a ceiling over a cathedral. The damp earth smelled rich and alive, a stark contrast to the hot, humid air back home. By the time we set up camp, the rain had dwindled to a light drizzle. Our fire crackled weakly against the moisture, but it was enough to ward off the chill. Benny was poking at the embers with a stick, while Sarah told one of her tales about a near miss with a bear on a hike out west. The rain-soaked forest around us was quiet, save for the occasional drip of water from the leaves above. Then we heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It started faint, like a low hum carried on the breeze. At first I thought it was the wind pushing through the trees, but it grew louder, more distinct. A mechanical sort of chittering, like gears grinding together, but organic. It sent a shiver down my spine. "You hear that?" I asked, breaking the lull in conversation. The others nodded, their faces mirroring my unease. Dave stood and scanned the dark forest, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Probably some kind of animal," he muttered, though his tone was far from confident. But this didn't sound like any animal I'd ever encountered. It seemed to move, circling our camp, the noise rising and falling as if whatever was out there was testing us. Sarah, always the rational one, suggested it might be a bird or some local wildlife unfamiliar to us. Benny, on the other hand, stayed quiet, his brow furrowed as he gripped the knife at his side. The firelight felt feeble against the oppressive darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My mind raced back to a TV show I'd watched about strange, unidentified creatures. The stories had seemed absurd at the time, tales of beings that defied explanation, lurking just beyond the reach of civilization. Yet here I was, feeling like I'd stepped into one of those episodes. The noise came closer, a sudden burst of clicks and whirs that made my heart leap. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed the rain-slicked bark and dense underbrush. Whatever it was staying out of sight. "We should stay close to the fire," Benny said, his voice low but steady. We did just that, huddling near the flickering flames as the rain continued to fall. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but my thoughts kept drifting back to my family. My sister back home, who always teased me for my love of hiking. My mom, who had a knack for making even the toughest situations seem manageable. I wondered what they'd say if they knew what was happening now. The sounds didn't stop. They grew more erratic, echoing through the woods like some twisted symphony. And then, as suddenly as they had started, they ceased. The silence was deafening, more unnerving than the noise itself. "We need to get out of here," Dave said, his voice tight. We agreed. But the rain and the darkness made it impossible to navigate the narrow trails back to the road. We decided to wait until dawn, taking shifts to keep watch. The hours dragged on, each minute punctuated by the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves that made my heart pound. The creature, if that's what it was still out there. We could feel it. When the first light of morning broke through the clouds, we wasted no time. We packed what we could carry and left the fire burning, unwilling to linger any longer than necessary. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making every step a struggle. We moved quickly but cautiously, our ears straining for any sign of the thing that had haunted us through the night. Halfway to the main road, we heard it again, a guttural, metallic growl closer than before. We broke into a run, fear driving us forward. I didn't look back, but I could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush behind us. It was fast, and it was closing in. Benny stumbled, his foot caught on a root. Dave and I pulled him up, our breaths ragged as we pushed on. The noise was almost deafening now, a cacophony of clicks and growls that seemed to surround us. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We reached the road moments later, gasping for air. A beat-up pickup truck was approaching, its headlights cutting through the gray morning light. The driver, an older man with a skeptical look, didn't ask many questions when we waved him down. He let us pile into the back, and as the truck pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the woods. The trees stood tall and silent, their secrets hidden once more. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I ever wanted to meet again. The wind howled through the Wyoming woods, rattling the old window panes of the cabin we'd rented for a long overdue getaway. Autumn here had a bite to it, the crisp air carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. I stood by the fire, scratching Mutt's ears. He was a scrappy-looking dog, a mix of who knows what, with wiry fur and a nose that seemed to twitch at every sound. I'd picked him up at a shelter back in Detroit, where I worked fixing IT systems and dreaming about the open road. Mutt had been my constant companion since riding shotgun in my old Mustang whenever I needed to clear my head. The cabin was a simple place. One large room with a couple of bunks, a wood stove, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. My friends and I, Alex, who had a knack for getting into trouble, Melanie, who claimed she'd never been scared in her life, and Pete, always the skeptic, were here to relax, hike, and drink in the beauty of the season. Wyoming in the fall had a rugged charm, with its towering pines and aspens blazing gold against a slate-gray sky. That first night, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls. We were gathered around the fire, trading stories and roasting marshmallows, when Mutt's ears perked up. He stood, his hackles raised, and let out a low growl. "What's up with him?" Alex asked, leaning back in his chair. I shrugged, but my stomach twisted. Mutt wasn't one to spook easily. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense line of trees just beyond the clearing. I didn't see anything, but Mutt's growling didn't stop. "Maybe it's just a deer," Melanie said, though her voice wavered. "Or a coyote," Pete added, ever the realist. We let it go and eventually settled back into our conversation, though the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The next day was uneventful, though the wind persisted, scattering leaves across the porch and making the trees sway like dancers in a slow, eerie waltz. We spent the morning hiking through the woods, marveling at the sheer vastness of the landscape. The air was sharp and invigorating, and for a while I felt the weight of city life melt away. Still, Mutt stayed close, his usual curiosity replaced by a nervous energy. That night, it happened. We were back around the fire, the wind roaring outside. Mutt was restless, pacing the cabin and letting out occasional whines. I was just about to take him outside when I saw it, movement at the edge of the tree line. At first, it looked like a man, standing half-concealed behind a thick pine. But something was off. The figure was too still, its silhouette too elongated. My chest tightened as the firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. I squinted, trying to make out its features, but it remained motionless, just staring. "What the hell is that?" Alex whispered, noticing where I was looking. The others turned, their faces pale as they followed my gaze. Melanie grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the figure. The beam hit the tree, but whatever it was had moved. It didn't make a sound, yet it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. We bolted the door and stayed close to the fire, each of us on edge. I couldn't help but think of the stories I'd heard as a kid, tales of shapeshifters and trickster spirits that haunted the woods. A camp counselor had once scared the hell out of us with a story about a creature that could mimic voices and appearances to lure people into the forest. I hadn't believed it then, but now, the night dragged on. The wind battered the cabin, and every creak of the wood set my nerves on edge. Mutt wouldn't settle, his growls growing louder and more insistent. Around midnight, we heard it. A series of guttural, almost human-like sounds circling the cabin. The thing was out there, toying with us. "Do you think it's some kind of animal?" Pete asked, his voice trembling. "No animal sounds like that," Melanie replied, clutching a knife. We stayed up all night, taking turns keeping watch. The fire burned low, and the wind carried strange noises. Cracks, whispers, and that awful, inhuman chattering. I kept replaying the moment I'd seen it, that unnatural stillness and the feeling of being scrutinized. It was like it was trying to decide whether we were worth the trouble. By dawn, we couldn't take it anymore. The plan was to head for the main road a few miles away and hope for a passing car. We packed quickly, leaving the fire smoldering, and stepped into the clearing. The woods were eerily quiet, the wind gone. It felt like the calm before a storm. We moved fast, sticking together as we navigated the muddy trails. Mutt stayed close, his ears pinned back. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the trees. The thing was following us, keeping just out of sight. Then came the attack. It happened so fast. Pete was at the back of the group when something lunged at him from the underbrush. He screamed as claws tore into his shoulder, dragging him down. Alex and I rushed to pull him free while Melanie swung her flashlight at the creature. For a split second, I saw it up close. Twisted limbs, a face that was almost human but horribly wrong. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence. We managed to get Pete on his feet, though he was bleeding badly. The thing didn't follow, but we could feel its presence as we stumbled toward the road. When we finally reached it, a battered pickup truck was waiting. The driver, a weathered old man, took one look at us and told us to get in without asking questions. As the truck rumbled away, I looked back at the woods. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their golden leaves catching the morning sun. It looked so peaceful, but I knew better. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and I hoped I'd never see it again. Arnold Mortensen pulled his pickup into the cracked asphalt lot of a small, weather-beaten gas station off a lonely stretch of highway in rural Maine. The leaves had already turned, a patchwork of fiery reds and golds against the steel-gray sky. A chill hung in the air, the kind that hinted at winter's approach. Next to him, his dog Rex, a stocky mutt with mismatched eyes, perked up his ears and sniffed the air. Arnold figured Rex wasn't used to the damp, bat-woodsy smells of New England. Neither was he, for that matter. Back in Boulder, the air was crisper, drier, and carried the faint scent of pine on windy days. Arnold stepped out, stretched his legs, and rubbed the back of his neck. He'd been driving for hours, heading nowhere in particular. Ever since he left Colorado, it was just him, Rex, and the open road. He figured a few days exploring Maine's wilderness would do him good. He wasn't running from anything exactly. He just needed the solitude. Working on cars day in and day out didn't leave much room for reflection, and lately he'd been thinking a lot about his parents. His dad had been a carpenter, his hands rough but steady, and his mom had an uncanny knack for remembering the details of every movie they ever watched together. Arnold guessed he got his love of films from her. The station attendant was an older man with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. They exchanged a few words about the weather before Arnold grabbed some supplies, jerky, water, and a bundle of firewood, and paid for gas. The attendant watched him as he loaded Rex into the truck. "You heading up to the woods?" the man asked, his tone cautious. "Yeah, figured I'd camp out a few nights," Arnold replied, throwing a grin over his shoulder. The attendant nodded slowly. "Well, stay safe. Weather's turning, and folks say these woods have stories." Arnold chuckled. "Stories, huh? Like Bigfoot?" The old man didn't laugh. "Something like that." Arnold brushed it off, though the man's words lingered in the back of his mind as he drove deeper into the wilderness. By the time he reached a clearing surrounded by towering maples and oaks, the sky had grown heavy with clouds. He set up camp, built a fire, and let Rex roam while he unpacked. The first night passed uneventfully, save for the distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustle of leaves. But on the second night, things changed. Arnold was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to decide whether the plot of the thing held up after all these years when Rex growled low and deep. Arnold's head snapped up. Rex stood stiff, his gaze fixed on the edge of the clearing where the trees cast long, light-shifting shadows in the firelight. "Probably just a deer," Arnold muttered, though his own voice didn't sound convincing. Rex didn't relax. Instead, he took a step closer to the trees, his tail rigid. Arnold grabbed the flashlight from his pack and shined it into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but gnarled branches and fallen leaves. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. For hours, Rex refused to settle. Arnold dozed off eventually, but his sleep was fitful. The next morning, he found tracks in the mud near the edge of the clearing, huge clawed prints that looked almost human, but not quite. That evening, the unease only grew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to come alive with noises, snapping twigs, faint whispers carried by the wind. Rex stayed close to the fire, his hackles raised. And then Arnold saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. Its pale, almost luminescent skin stood out against the shadows, and its eyes glinted like wet stones in the firelight. It didn't move. It just stared. "Jesus," Arnold breathed, his heart pounding. He grabbed his hunting knife, more for comfort than defense. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. The figure didn't answer. Slowly it shifted, slipping behind the tree and out of sight. But Arnold could feel it, circling the camp, staying just beyond the reach of the firelight. The stories the attendant mentioned came rushing back. He hadn't paid them much mind then, but now he remembered reading about something similar in a magazine years ago. The article had described creatures called Rugaru, cursed beings that stalked the woods, drawn to those who ventured too far from safety. He dismissed it as folklore, but this felt real. Arnold knew they couldn't stay. He packed what he could, keeping an eye on the shifting shadows. The creature never attacked, but its presence was suffocating, its unseen gaze a constant weight. The fire burned low as Arnold grabbed Rex's leash and prepared to leave. They moved quickly, the forest closing in around them. The creature followed, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. Arnold tripped once, tearing his jacket on a branch, but Rex barked and pulled him forward. They didn't stop until they reached the road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and Arnold waved frantically. The driver, a middle-aged woman in a station wagon, stopped and let them in without hesitation. She didn't ask questions, and Arnold didn't offer explanations. He was too shaken to speak, his mind replaying the image of that pale figure staring at him from the darkness. As they drove away, the forest receded into the distance, its secrets hidden once more. Arnold glanced at Rex, who had finally relaxed, his head resting on Arnold's lap. He scratched the dog's ears and whispered, "Good boy." The woman dropped them off at a nearby motel. Arnold spent the night locked in his room, the curtains drawn tight. He didn't sleep much, his thoughts returning to the old man at the gas station and the creature that had stalked them through the woods. He knew he'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. The snow crunched underfoot as I trudged through the frozen wilderness of northern Wisconsin. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale, golden light over the endless expanse of trees and snow. This part of the state was as remote as it got, a perfect place to get away from the world. I'd spent 2 days out here already, the silence a balm to my frayed nerves. Back in Boston, the world never seemed to stop moving. Even at night, the hum of the city found a way to seep through the cracks. But out here, it was calm. Too calm. I'd set up camp near a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The snow piled high around the fire pit, the heat from the flames melting a small circle in the icy ground. The air was crisp, and my breath plumed in the cold like smoke. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers drift into the night sky. This wasn't my first winter hike, though it was my first one this deep into the wilderness. As a soldier, I'd been in tougher conditions than this. Frozen nights in the mountains, blistering days in the desert. But this was different. There was no mission, no squad to watch my back. It was just me in the woods. I figured I'd spend one more night here, then hike out in the morning. The rumors had crossed my mind more than once since I'd arrived. Stories of Bigfoot were as old as the hills, and Wisconsin had its fair share of them. Supposedly, these creatures, massive, intelligent, and elusive, roamed the forests, avoiding humans, but not always peacefully. Back home, I might have laughed it off. Out here, surrounded by endless wilderness, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. I tossed another log onto the fire and leaned back against a tree, my mind wandering to memories of my younger brother. He'd always been the skeptic in the family, quick to dismiss anything that couldn't be proven. He used to say I spent too much time with my Warhammer miniatures, painting tiny soldiers while he went out to parties. I wondered what he'd say if I told him where I was now. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, snapping me out of my thoughts. I sat up, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife strapped to my belt. The sound wasn't like the normal creaks and groans of the forest. It was deliberate, heavy. Something was moving out there. I stared into the darkness, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the snow. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then from the shadows I saw it, a massive shape, half hidden by the trees. It moved slowly, almost cautiously, but there was no mistaking its size. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its broad shoulders covered in matted dark fur. 2 glowing eyes stared back at me, reflecting the firelight. My pulse quickened. I'd heard the stories, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. It wasn't human, but there was intelligence in its gaze. Something calculating. I stood, knife in hand, trying to decide whether to stay or run. Before I could make up my mind, the creature let out a guttural growl, low and resonant, that sent a shiver down my spine. The fire seemed to shrink as the creature stepped closer, its massive feet crunching through the snow. I backed away, my mind racing. I'd faced danger before, but this was different. This was primal. I threw a burning log toward it, hoping to scare it off. The log landed in the snow with a hiss, but the creature didn't flinch. It bared its teeth, a row of jagged, yellow fangs, and lunged. I didn't think. I ran. The woods were a blur of white and brown as I sprinted through the trees, the creature's heavy footfalls thundering behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. I stumbled once, catching myself against a tree, and glanced back. It was closer now, its massive form weaving through the trees with terrifying speed. I had no plan, no destination. I just knew I had to keep moving. The snow made every step a struggle, my boots sinking into the drifts. My legs ached, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I could hear the creature snarling behind me, its breath loud and wet. A small stream cut through the woods ahead, its surface frozen over. I skidded across it, barely keeping my balance. On the other side, the trees thinned, and I spotted a faint trail cutting through the snow. My heart leapt. This had to lead to the village I'd passed through on my way in. The creature roared, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the ground beneath me. I pushed myself harder, the trail winding through the trees like a lifeline. My legs screamed in protest, but the thought of stopping was unthinkable. Finally, the trees opened up, revealing a narrow road. I stumbled onto the asphalt, my chest heaving. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. I waved my arms, shouting for help. The car slowed, and a man rolled down his window, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Please," I gasped. "Just drive." The man didn't ask questions. I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands shaking, and we sped off. I glanced back through the rear window, half expecting to see the creature burst from the trees, but the road remained empty. The driver dropped me off at the village, where I found a small inn and locked myself in for the night. Sleep didn't come easily. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a reminder of those glowing eyes in the darkness. I left at first light, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. The creature was real. I was sure of that now. The stories weren't just stories. And as I drove away from those woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before us, a barren sea of red rock and cacti under the oppressive summer sun. It was the kind of heat that could melt the soles of your boots if you weren't careful. The 4 of us, me, Jenna, Mike, and Luke, had planned this trip for months, a chance to escape the monotony of our lives and spend a couple of days exploring the desert's stark beauty. We'd even brought my dog, Scout, a wiry mutt with enough energy to outrun any of us. We were near the Mogollon Rim, an area where the desert bled into thick stretches of pine forest. The locals called it a strange place, the kind that bred whispers and campfire stories. Back home in Texas, we had our own share of strange tales, but this part of Arizona had a reputation. Old legends about creatures lurking in the shadows of the woods. I remembered reading a few of them in one of those yellowed, sensational newspapers, the kind you only find at gas stations. Werewolves. Not the Hollywood kind, but something primal, something ancient. The day's hike had been brutal. The heat bore down on us without mercy, and by the time we found a decent clearing to set up camp, I felt like my legs were made of lead. Scout flopped down in the shade, panting heavily, his tongue lolling out of his mouth. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The temperature dropped quickly, the air turning crisp and dry. We built a fire, its glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. Jenna was telling some story about her last camping trip when Scout's ears perked up. He let out a low growl, his hackles rising. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scanning the edge of the clearing. The firelight didn't reach far, and the shadows beyond seemed to deepen with every passing second. We all fell silent, listening. The desert had its own kind of quiet, filled with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of a breeze through the brush. But now it was different. There was a stillness that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground. Scout barked, his voice sharp and frantic. Jenna and Mike exchanged nervous glances, while Luke reached for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Probably a coyote," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. Coyotes didn't sound like that. The growl came again, closer this time, and we caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. A pair of glowing eyes stared at us from the darkness, their amber light unnatural and unblinking. The creature stepped forward, just enough for the firelight to catch it. It was huge, its body covered in coarse, matted fur, its shoulders hunched unnaturally, and its long limbs ended in clawed hands. But the face, that was the worst part. It was a grotesque blend of human and wolf with a muzzle full of sharp yellow teeth. "What the hell is that?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. The creature didn't charge. Instead, it prowled around the edge of the clearing, its eyes never leaving us. It was toying with us, like a cat with a cornered mouse. Scout barked again, but this time the sound was cut off as the creature let out a deafening roar. It was a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Without warning, it lunged, its speed a blur. Scout darted forward, barking furiously, but the creature swiped him aside like he was nothing. Jenna screamed, and Mike grabbed a burning log from the fire, swinging it wildly. The creature snarled, retreating just enough to keep out of reach. "We have to get out of here," Luke said, his voice shaking. But where could we go? The desert at night was a labyrinth of shadows, and the creature was faster, stronger. Still, staying here wasn't an option. We grabbed what we could, knives, a flashlight, and a first aid kit, and ran. Scout limped behind us, whimpering but still moving. The creature didn't follow immediately. It was almost as if it wanted us to run. The desert was eerily quiet as we moved, our footsteps crunching on the dry earth. We stuck close together, every sound making us jump. The creature's growls echoed around us, coming from different directions, as if it was circling. At one point, we found a rocky outcrop and huddled there, trying to catch our breath. Scout lay at my feet, his sides heaving. I stroked his fur, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. "I should have stayed in Texas," I muttered, thinking of my family. My dad had always been a steady presence, the kind of man who could make you feel safe even when the world was falling apart. I wished he was here now. The creature found us again. This time it didn't wait. It charged, and we scattered, running blindly through the darkness. I heard Jenna scream, followed by a sickening thud. I didn't look back. I couldn't. By some miracle, we found a narrow ravine and squeezed into it. The walls were high enough to offer some protection, and we moved as quietly as we could. The creature's growls faded, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was hunting us, and it was patient. Hours passed. The night seemed endless. We crept through the ravine, every step deliberate and silent. The calm night air felt suffocating, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. Finally, as the first hints of dawn painted the sky, we stumbled onto a dirt road. A truck was coming down the path, its headlights piercing the gloom. We flagged it down, practically throwing ourselves in front of it. The driver, a grizzled old man, took one look at us and nodded. "Get in," he said. We didn't ask questions. As the truck rumbled away, I looked back. The creature was there, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Its eyes glowed in the early light, and for a moment I thought it might follow. But it didn't. It just stood there, its massive form blending into the trees as the truck carried us to safety. The rain was relentless, a steady drumbeat on the hood of the car. The wipers scraped across the windshield, barely clearing the view of the winding forest road ahead. Autumn in Maine had a way of feeling oppressive, with dark clouds hanging low and the trees casting long shadows even during the day. Our road trip had been smooth until the car sputtered, coughed, and finally died. A busted radiator, or so it seemed. None of us were mechanics. It was me, Dean Oldman, my dog Chase, and my two friends, Sarah and Tom. We'd pulled over to the side of a desolate stretch of road, miles from the nearest town. Chase, a mutt with floppy ears and an eager personality, barked at the rain from the back seat. I was frustrated, but being a police officer, I was used to dealing with unexpected situations. However, I wasn't in New Orleans anymore, where the humid nights and lively streets could turn even the worst moods into something tolerable. Maine's wilderness was isolating, quiet, and unnerving. Sarah tried calling for help, but there was no signal, typical for the middle of nowhere. We decided to wait out the storm and figure things out in the morning. I grabbed my flashlight, Chase's leash, and a few blankets, and we set up camp just off the road, under a cluster of trees that offered some shelter from the rain. Tom managed to get a fire going, and we huddled around it, the orange glow our only comfort against the encroaching dark. As the fire crackled, my mind wandered. I thought of my family back home, my dad's stories about his own hiking trips, my mom's constant reminder to stay safe. They'd probably roll their eyes at me now, stranded with no backup plan. I smiled despite myself. Then again, I'd watched enough YouTube videos about Bigfoot sightings in places like this to know that Maine was prime territory for those kinds of tales. They were fun to watch, but never something I took seriously. Chase's growl snapped me out of my thoughts. He stood rigid, his ears perked, staring into the trees. "What is it, boy?" I asked, standing and grabbing the flashlight. The others went quiet, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. I shined the light into the woods, but the beam barely penetrated the thick underbrush. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow too large to be an animal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Probably a deer," Tom said, his voice lacking conviction. "Deer don't make Chase act like this," I muttered. Chase barked once, sharp and loud, before falling silent again, his gaze fixed on the same spot. Then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a grunt. It came from somewhere in the darkness, and it wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever encountered. The firelight flickered, and the shadows seemed to deepen. "Okay, that's not a deer," Sarah whispered, clutching her jacket tighter. The sound came again, closer this time. A branch snapped, and I caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it around, finally landing on a pair of glowing eyes. It was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of man and beast, with wide, piercing eyes and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Bigfoot. I'd laughed at the videos before, but seeing it now, all I felt was cold terror. "Run!" I yelled, but before we could move, the creature lunged forward, its speed defying its size. Chase barked furiously, straining against his leash as I held him back. The thing swiped at the fire, scattering embers and sending shadows dancing wildly around us. We scrambled to grab our things, but there was no time to think. The creature let out a roar, so loud it seemed to shake the ground. Tom grabbed a burning branch and swung it at the beast, forcing it to back off momentarily. We bolted, Chase leading the way. The rain had turned the ground into a muddy mess, making every step a struggle. I could hear the creature crashing through the woods behind us, its growls mixing with the sound of the storm. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline pushing me forward. We ran for what felt like hours, slipping and stumbling through the dense forest. Sarah tripped at one point, twisting her ankle. I hoisted her up, my training kicking in as I scanned for any sign of the creature. The rain masked its movements, but I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond sight. Finally, we reached a clearing where an old logging road cut through the trees. It was our only chance. "Stay together," I said, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at me. We followed the road, moving as quickly as Sarah's injury would allow. The creature's growls grew distant, but I knew better than to think we were safe. Bigfoot wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it was hunting us. As dawn broke, the rain began to ease, and we stumbled onto a paved road. A pickup truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the mist. I waved it down, nearly collapsing in relief when it stopped. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, looked us over and didn't ask any questions. "Get in," he said, and we didn't need to be told twice. As we drove away, I looked back. The forest loomed behind us, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Bigfoot was out there, and we were lucky to have made it out alive. The rain was falling in heavy sheets, soaking the Wyoming wilderness and muffling every sound. I could hear the water trickling off leaves and into the underbrush, blending with the crackling fire we had managed to build under a makeshift tarp. It was supposed to be a simple hunting trip, a way to unwind with friends. Instead, it turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. My name is Arnold Oldman, and I'm a firefighter from Denver. I grew up surrounded by the Rocky Mountains, learning to respect the wild while also developing a knack for strategy, something I honed over long nights playing Warhammer 40K. I brought my dog Chase, a mutt with a glossy black coat and a nose for trouble. Along with me were my friends, Ethan and Luke, seasoned hunters who had talked me into joining them. We'd set out early that morning, the sky overcast but not yet threatening rain. By noon, the storm rolled in. It was unrelenting, drenching us as we trudged deeper into the woods, rifles slung over our shoulders. The forest felt alive, but not in the comforting way I remembered from my childhood trips. Something about the dense thickets and towering pines felt wrong, like we were being watched. Chase was the first to pick up on it. He stopped in his tracks, his ears swiveling and nose twitching. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, kneeling to pat him. His body was rigid, his gaze fixed on a patch of trees up ahead. "He probably smells a deer," Ethan said, but there was doubt in his voice. I tightened my grip on my rifle. "Maybe," I replied, though my gut told me otherwise. I'd seen a TV show once about wendigos, cannibalistic creatures from native folklore said to stalk the wilderness. They were supposed to be emaciated with long limbs and hollow eyes, their hunger unending. It was just a story, but out here, under the oppressive weight of the storm, it didn't feel so far-fetched. The first sign something was wrong came a few hours later. We found tracks, hoof prints in the mud, but they weren't normal. They were too large, with claw-like impressions at the edges. Chase sniffed at them and whimpered, backing away. "That's not a deer," Luke muttered, his usual bravado gone. We followed the tracks, curiosity overriding our better judgment. The forest grew darker, the rain heavier, and the air colder. Then we saw it, a figure hunched and gaunt, standing just at the edge of the clearing. It looked wrong, its limbs too long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The firelight reflected in its eyes, and I swear they glowed. "What the hell is that?" Ethan breathed, his voice barely audible. The creature turned its head toward us, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. Then it let out a screech, a sound that cut through the storm and pierced straight to my bones. It charged, faster than anything that size should be able to move. We scattered, instinct taking over. Chase barked furiously as I yanked him by the leash, running blindly through the trees. I could hear Luke shouting, a gunshot ringing out, but it did nothing to deter the thing. It was on us, a blur of claws and teeth. Luke went down first. I saw the creature swipe at him, tearing into his side. His scream was drowned out by the storm. Ethan fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest, but it barely flinched. It turned to him, its hollow eyes narrowing. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. Chase and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. We found a small rock outcropping and huddled beneath it, the rain cascading down like a curtain. I checked my phone, no signal. My mind raced. Luke was gone, Ethan probably too, and that thing was still out there. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up, and neither did the feeling that we were being stalked. I kept the fire going, knowing it was a double-edged sword. It provided warmth and light, but also gave away our position. Chase pressed against me, his body trembling. I thought of my family back in Denver. My sister used to joke that I was too brave for my own good, always diving headfirst into danger. She wasn't wrong. But this wasn't a burning building or a car wreck. This was something I couldn't explain, couldn't fight. By dawn, the rain had eased, and I knew we had to move. The creature hadn't attacked again, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. We made our way back toward where we'd parked, sticking to the denser parts of the forest for cover. When we finally reached the car, I almost cried with relief. Ethan was there, slumped against the door, bloodied but alive. Luke didn't make it, he rasped, his voice hollow. We didn't wait to find out if the creature was still following. I threw Chase into the back seat, helped Ethan into the passenger seat, and floored it. The tires spun in the mud before catching, and we sped down the dirt road, the forest blurring past. Even now, I don't know what we saw out there. The authorities didn't believe our story, chalking it up to a bear attack. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't human. It was something else, something that still haunts my dreams. We had planned the camping trip as a last hurrah before the Pacific Northwest was swallowed by the cold grip of winter. The trees were still aflame with the reds and oranges of fall, their leaves littering the forest floor in a vibrant patchwork. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and pine. For a postman like me, Kurt Rambo, who spent most of his days navigating San Francisco's chaotic streets, it was a much-needed escape. I brought my dog, Sparky, a wiry terrier mix who was as tenacious as he was curious. Along for the trip were my childhood friends, Laura and Peter. We'd set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering firs and cedars. The first day had been perfect, hiking through trails, swapping stories, and laughing around the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. The snow came that night, a surprise even for autumn. It was light at first, a soft dusting that added a surreal beauty to the landscape. But by the next morning it had grown heavier and the temperature had dropped sharply. As the day wore on, something felt off. Sparky was restless, pacing the edge of the camp with his ears perked. Peter joked that he was chasing ghosts, but even Laura, who never spooked easily, seemed uneasy. I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the woods. San Francisco had taught me to be wary of people, not the wilderness. The first sign of trouble came when we stumbled upon tracks during an afternoon hike. They were large, like a deer's, but elongated, with toes instead of hooves. Sparky growled low in his throat, the hackles on his back rising. "Maybe it's a cougar," Peter said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tracks circled our camp in erratic loops, vanishing into the dense underbrush. By nightfall, the snow was falling steadily, muffling the sounds of the forest. We sat around the fire, trying to shake the unease. Sparky refused to settle, staring into the darkness with a low whine. I tried to reassure him, but the feeling of being watched was growing unbearable. I kept a hatchet close, just in case. It was Laura who saw it first. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes locked on the shadows beyond the firelight. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Peter and I followed her gaze, but all I saw was the dancing shadows cast by the flames. "What?" I asked, my voice more annoyed than I intended. The tension was getting to me. "There was something out there," she insisted. "It looked like a person." We all fell silent, straining to hear past the crackle of the fire. A branch snapped in the distance, followed by a soft rustling. Sparky barked sharply, his leash taut as he lunged toward the sound. Peter grabbed his rifle. "I'll check it out," he said, but I stopped him. "Stay here," I said. "If it's an animal, we don't want to spook it." The three of us stood by the fire, scanning the shadows. Then we heard it, a voice. faint and distorted, calling my name. Kurt. It wasn't right. The cadence was off, too slow, like someone struggling to mimic human speech. Laura grabbed my arm. "Don't go," she said. That's not normal." Before I could respond, Sparky slipped his leash and bolted into the woods. I cursed and ran after him, the others close behind. The snow made the going slow, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. I called Sparky's name, but there was no answer. We found him near a small clearing, barking furiously at something I couldn't see. Then the smell hit me. Rotting flesh, sour and cloying. I turned my flashlight toward the trees and froze. It was standing there, half hidden by the trunk of a fir. Its form was wrong, elongated and skeletal, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's, but there was a terrible intelligence in them. It opened its mouth, and the voice came again, this time louder. "Kurt." I grabbed Sparky and backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The creature stepped into the light, revealing hands tipped with claws and a face that looked almost human. Almost. Laura screamed, and Peter fired his rifle. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, vanishing into the trees. We ran back to camp, hearts racing. Sparky barked nonstop, his body trembling. The creature didn't attack again, but we could hear it circling, its voice echoing from different directions. It was playing with us. We knew we couldn't stay. Packing quickly, we doused the fire and slipped into the woods, moving as silently as we could. The snow absorbed every sound, but the creature's presence was always there, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. Laura was the first to falter, her foot slipping on a hidden root. Peter helped her up, but the noise seemed to draw the creature closer. We saw its outline again, just ahead, and ducked into a thicket, holding our breath as it passed. Its stench lingered long after it disappeared. After hours of navigating the dark, snowy forest, we finally reached the road. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a kindly older man, took one look at our faces and didn't ask questions. We piled in, Sparky curling up on my lap, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what we encountered in those woods. I'd never heard of a skinwalker before that night, but I've since learned they're creatures of Navajo lore, shapeshifters said to be witches who can take the form of animals or people. Whether that's what it was, I can't say. All I know is that it was something unnatural, something evil, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. We decided to hike the Catskills one weekend in late April. Spring had arrived in New York State, and the forest was coming alive after a long, bitter winter. The air was crisp and earthy, the kind of scent that only comes with thawing soil and budding leaves. It was perfect hiking weather. Calm skies, mild temperatures, and trails framed by the first flush of green. I had come along with 3 friends. Mike, a quiet guy with an encyclopedic knowledge of wildlife. Ellie, who could make even the dullest moments exciting. And Jake, who insisted on carrying his camera to document the adventure. My dog, Buddy, a stocky mutt with floppy ears and an endless reserve of energy, rounded out the group. For someone from Seattle like me, David Starsky, the East Coast forests felt different. They lacked the towering evergreens and constant drizzle I'd grown up with, but they had their own charm. The Catskills were dense with maples and birches, their pale trunks weaving a maze around us. Birds sang in the canopy, their calls sharp and cheerful in the stillness. We spent the morning trekking up a winding trail that led to a rocky overlook. The view was stunning, rolling hills stretching to the horizon, the kind of scene that made you forget your legs were sore and your pack was too heavy. After lunch, we descended deeper into the woods, veering off the marked trail in search of a rumored waterfall Jake had read about online. That's when things began to feel off. At first, it was subtle. Buddy, usually fearless, started hesitating, sniffing the air with his hackles raised. The birdsong quieted, leaving an eerie stillness that seemed unnatural. Ellie joked about it being a scene from a horror movie, but her laugh was nervous. We found the waterfall, less impressive than we'd hoped, and decided to set up a small camp nearby for a rest. Jake started a fire while Ellie rummaged for snacks. Buddy kept circling the area, growling softly at the trees. I tried to calm him, but his unease was contagious. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long and thin. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Buddy barked furiously, his body stiff with tension. Jake froze, his hand halfway to his camera. "What was that?" Ellie whispered. The growl came again, closer this time. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. I'd heard both during my hikes in Washington, and this was different. Deeper. Meaner. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack, my heart pounding. Then we saw it. A massive figure moved between the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the fading light. It was tall, taller than any man, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its movements were unnervingly quiet for something so large. "Maybe it's a moose," Mike suggested, though his voice betrayed his doubt. The figure stepped closer, and the firelight caught its eyes, reflective, amber, and filled with something that wasn't animal instinct. It was worse than that. It felt like malice. Before we could react, it lunged. Buddy barked and leapt at it, but the creature swatted him aside with terrifying ease. Ellie screamed, and Jake dropped his camera, fumbling for the flashlight in his pocket. I swung the hatchet more out of desperation than strategy, but the creature was too fast. It knocked me off balance and grabbed Mike, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed briefly, then were swallowed by the silence. We didn't think. We ran. The forest became a blur, branches slapping at my face as we stumbled through the underbrush. Buddy, limping but determined, stayed close to my heels. Jake and Ellie were ahead, their breaths ragged and panicked. We stopped only when we reached a clearing, our lungs burning and our legs trembling. The fire was long forgotten, left smoldering back at the campsite. Ellie clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" she gasped. I shook my head, unable to answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Then I remembered something I'd read years ago in one of those trashy tabloid magazines you find in waiting rooms. The Catskills were rumored to be home to Bigfoot, or Sasquatch as the locals called it. I'd laughed it off at the time, but now Jake's flashlight flickered, its weak beam cutting through the gloom. "We need to keep moving," he said. "It's still out there." The creature's howl confirmed it. A bone-chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It was hunting us. We moved as quickly as we could, sticking to the direction we thought would lead us back to the trailhead. Buddy whimpered occasionally, but he stayed close, his loyalty unshaken despite his injuries. The forest seemed endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent our hearts racing. Twice we thought we saw it, just a fleeting shadow, a hint of movement, but we didn't stop to confirm. When we finally stumbled onto a dirt path, it felt like a miracle. The village wasn't far now. We could see the faint glow of streetlights through the trees, a beacon of safety. The creature didn't follow us past the tree line. Maybe it feared the lights, or maybe it was satisfied with its catch. I don't know. We reached the village, shaken but alive, and found help at a small diner. No one believed our story, of course. They chalked it up to stress, to wild imaginations and the tricks of the woods. But I know what we saw. We never found Mike. And I'll never step foot in those woods again. Damian Smith always had a thing for road trips, especially when the air turned crisp in the fall. This time, his destination was Louisiana, a state with its own brand of charm and mystery. He'd loaded up his old Ford Bronco with supplies, his toolbox, just in case, and his dog, Shadow, a wiry mutt with an oversized personality. Miami, where Damian lived and worked as a postman, didn't offer much in the way of seasonal changes, and he was looking forward to a landscape painted in oranges, reds, and yellows. He hadn't planned much beyond a few nights of exploring back roads and enjoying the peace of the bayou. The trip started off smoothly enough. He'd driven through towns so small they didn't seem to have a stoplight, let alone cell service. The rain had started on his second day, a slow drizzle at first, then heavier, painting the world outside his windshield in watery streaks. It was the kind of rain that clung to everything, soaking the earth and turning dirt roads into mud traps. By the third evening, Damien found himself parked at the edge of a swamp near an old wooded area. The rain had lightened to a steady patter, and the air smelled thick with damp earth and decaying leaves. He'd set up a small fire to dry off and warm up. Shadow curled up at his feet. The forest seemed alive with noise, croaking frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of unseen critters. It was peaceful in its way, though Damien kept a hunting knife close. You never knew what might come sniffing around in places like this. He was midway through poking at the fire when Shadow perked up, ears alert, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Damien paused, his hand frozen over the flames. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, scanning the tree line. At first, there was nothing. Then he caught it. A flicker of movement in the shadows, too fast and too big to be a deer. His heart thudded in his chest as Shadow's growls grew more insistent. Damien grabbed his flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of eyes, yellow, glowing, and far too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew. Then they were gone. Probably a bear, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. He'd seen bears before. This wasn't one. The next hour passed tensely. Shadow refused to settle, pacing near the fire and barking at every rustle. Damien finally decided to pack up and move. Something about the woods felt wrong, like they were watching him. As he loaded the Bronco, he heard it. A sound so guttural and low it made his skin crawl. It wasn't a growl exactly, but it came from deep in the forest. Shadow whined and bolted into the back of the truck without needing to be told. Damien climbed in, slamming the door just as something heavy hit the side of the Bronco. The whole vehicle rocked, and Damien's breath hitched. He for his keys, but his hands were shaking too much to fit them into the ignition. Another impact followed, this time at the rear. Shadow barked furiously, and Damien finally got the engine roaring to life. He threw the Bronco into gear and peeled out onto the muddy road. The thing followed. At first, it was just a shadow in the rearview mirror, moving on all fours with an unnatural speed. Then it rose onto two legs, its silhouette horrifyingly human-like but distorted, long arms, a hunched posture, and a head too wolfish to belong to a man. Damien couldn't make out its face, but he didn't want to. The stories he'd heard growing up about Louisiana's swamps came flooding back. People whispered about strange creatures out here, things that were part man, part beast. He hadn't believed them until now. The Bronco fishtailed as Damien pushed it harder, the tires struggling against the wet, slippery road. The creature kept pace, its glowing eyes a constant reminder that he wasn't outrunning this thing. Then came the worst sound, a thump on the roof. Damien slammed the brakes, sending whatever was up there tumbling forward. He didn't wait to see where it landed. The moment he saw an opening in the trees, he veered off the road and into the forest, branches snapping against the windshield. The Bronco eventually bogged down in the mud, and Damien knew he couldn't drive any farther. He grabbed his knife, a flashlight, and the old tire iron he kept under the seat. Shadow stuck close as they moved through the woods, the rain now a cold drizzle that soaked through his clothes. They didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of a small village, its dim lights visible through the trees. He didn't remember much of how he made it there, only the sheer panic that pushed him forward. Shadow limped beside him, his usual energy replaced by exhaustion. In the safety of the village, Damien finally allowed himself to breathe. He told a local what had happened, and though they listened with a grave expression, they didn't seem surprised. "Sounds like you met the Rougarou," the man said, using the old Cajun word for what Damien now understood to be the Dogmen, a creature of swamp lore that was said to stalk these parts. Damien didn't respond. He just sat there, dripping wet and shivering, his mind replaying the night's events. One thing was certain, he wouldn't be venturing into Louisiana's woods again anytime soon. It was the kind of summer night where the air felt sticky and heavy, even after sundown. Dean Goodson had always been a fan of late-night drives, but this particular trip had been a spur-of-the-moment thing. He and his 3 friends, Laura, Marcus, and Tim, were road tripping through North Carolina with no real destination in mind. They'd just passed through Fayetteville and decided to make a quick stop in Bladenboro. The tiny gas station they pulled into looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 70s, with its peeling paint and flickering neon open sign. Dean parked his truck under the buzzing canopy lights while his dog Scout, a scruffy terrier mix, dozed in the back seat. Dean was the kind of guy who always seemed up for an adventure, but this trip wasn't about excitement. It was more about escape. Back home in San Francisco, where he worked as a delivery driver, life had started to feel too predictable. Nights like these, with the open road ahead and nothing but miles of possibilities, made him feel alive. "Get me a soda," Marcus called as Dean and Tim got out of the truck. Laura was already stretching her legs, glancing nervously at the dark woods that bordered the station. Inside, the gas station was quiet, save for the hum of a ceiling fan. A few locals loitered near the counter, giving the group polite nods. Dean grabbed a couple of waters and a bag of chips, trying not to think too hard about the ancient hunting magazine he'd flipped through earlier that week. It had been full of folklore about strange creatures in the southeast. Stories about things that could mimic voices, stalk prey for miles, and vanish without a trace. At the time, he'd laughed it off. Now, standing under the fluorescent lights, those stories felt a little closer to home. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees with a sound like whispered secrets. Scout was awake now, standing on alert with her ears perked. "What's her deal?" Laura asked, her voice low. Dean shrugged, but he could feel the tension creeping in. It wasn't unusual for Scout to be skittish in unfamiliar places, but this was different. She was growling softly, her gaze fixed on the line of trees beyond the gas station. "We should go," Laura said, her unease infectious. The group piled back into the truck, joking nervously about spooky small towns. But as Dean drove out of the gas station lot and onto a back road that wound through the woods, the laughter faded. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain hammered down, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The road was barely visible, and the truck's headlights seemed to illuminate only the nearest trees, leaving the rest of the world cloaked in darkness. That's when they heard it. A sharp, metallic slam against the side of the truck. Dean's hands tightened on the wheel as Scout barked furiously. "What the hell was that?" Tim asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, something darted across the road ahead. It was fast, too fast for them to see clearly, but the impression it left behind was wrong. Too big, too human. Dean slammed on the brakes, sending everyone jolting forward. The truck skidded to a stop, the rain pounding relentlessly. "What did you see?" Marcus demanded, but Dean couldn't answer. His heart was hammering in his chest, his mind replaying the brief glimpse of the creature. It had been hunched, its limbs elongated, its movement unnatural. A sound came from the woods, low and guttural, like a growl but deeper. It sent a chill down Dean's spine. Scout was barking wildly now, her small body pressed against the door as though she wanted to leap out and defend them. "We're leaving," Dean said, his voice firm. He threw the truck into reverse, but before he could back up, something hit the rear bumper hard enough to rock the vehicle. Marcus shouted, and Laura screamed as the truck's cabin filled with a terrible scratching sound, like claws raking against metal. Dean floored it, the tires spinning on the wet road before finding traction. The truck surged forward, but the sense of being followed was palpable. Whatever was out there wasn't giving up easily. The growling grew louder, punctuated by snapping branches and the occasional flash of movement in the periphery. "Keep driving," Laura yelled, her voice barely audible over the storm. The truck finally broke free of the woods, the road opening up into a clearing with an abandoned campsite. The group didn't want to stop, but the truck's engine sputtered, and Dean knew they couldn't keep going without a quick check. They jumped out, Scout at Dean's side, her leash taut as she strained against it. As they inspected the truck under the pale beam of a flashlight, The sense of being watched grew unbearable. The storm's fury seemed to lessen for a moment, the rain softening to a mist, and that's when they saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible but undeniably there, was the figure. It was humanoid but wrong, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "What is that?" Tim whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature didn't move. Then, it let out a sound that Dean could only describe as a mockery of human speech, a distorted, echoing mimicry of their own voices. It sent the group scrambling back into the truck. The engine roared to life on the second try, and they sped off, leaving the clearing and the thing behind. The creature didn't follow this time. They made it back to the main road, the truck wheezing but holding together. By the time they reached a motel in the next town, they were soaked, shaken, and silent. No one spoke of what they'd seen, but the looks they exchanged said enough. Dean sat up that night, Scout curled in his lap, unable to sleep. The magazine article came back to him, the one that mentioned skinwalkers, creatures of Navajo legend known for their ability to mimic and stalk. He hadn't believed it then. Now, he wasn't so sure. The gas station was one of those old-timey, weathered ones you only see in places like rural North Carolina. Its peeling paint and the faded sign out front were almost picturesque, a reminder of a slower-paced time. Dean Goodson pulled the van into the lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. The humid summer air was thick, heavy, with the promise of a storm. His friends Sarah, Marcus, and Jay were crammed into the van with him, along with Shadow, his golden mutt, who had a knack for sniffing out trouble and stealing attention wherever they went. Dean was used to the city, the constant hum of San Francisco, where he worked as a delivery driver. Out here, though, it was different. Bladenboro felt eerily quiet, like the world was holding its breath. He'd read about places like this in magazines he used to flip through while waiting on shipments. Remote, mysterious little towns with legends older than the roads that led to them. Inside the gas station, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and cheap coffee. Dean grabbed a map off a rack and pretended to study it while Marcus bought snacks. The attendant behind the counter looked at them with a kind of wary curiosity, like they didn't belong. "You folks camping around here?" the man asked, his accent thick. "Just passing through," Dean replied, though it wasn't entirely true. They'd planned to spend a couple of nights camping in the woods nearby. The idea had seemed fun back in San Francisco, but now Dean wasn't so sure. Something about the way the attendant stared made his skin crawl. The storm rolled in not long after they set up camp. Thunder grumbled low in the distance, and the trees around them shivered in the rising wind. Dean and his friends huddled around the fire, telling stories and laughing to shake off the unease that had settled over them since the gas station. Shadow sat at Dean's feet, his ears twitching at every sound. Dean absently scratched behind the dog's ears, trying to focus on Sarah's story about her wildest college party. But his thoughts kept drifting. He remembered a magazine he'd read years ago, one that had mentioned the Bladenboro beast, some kind of creature that had supposedly stalked the area in the 1950s. Locals had blamed it for livestock deaths, but the descriptions of the creature were all over the place. Part wolf, part cat, part something else entirely. It was the kind of folklore that made for a good campfire story, but now, sitting out here with the storm raging, it felt uncomfortably real. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. The fire had burned low, and most of them were dozing in their chairs. Shadow's growl was what woke Dean, low, menacing, and unlike anything he'd heard from the dog before. He sat up, blinking against the darkness, and saw the fur on Shadow's back standing on end. "What is it, boy?" Dean whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Shadow didn't respond, just stared into the trees. Dean followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Still, an unease crept over him, as if the woods themselves were watching. Then came the sound, a rustling, faint at first, then louder, like something moving through the underbrush. Dean's heart pounded as he grabbed the flashlight. The beam swept across the trees, illuminating the rain-soaked leaves, but nothing else. Probably just an animal, Marcus muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. The rustling grew closer. Dean stood, knife in hand, as the others woke and scrambled to their feet. The firelight flickered against the dark, casting eerie shadows. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, hunched and misshapen. At first, Dean thought it was a person, a hunter maybe, but as the light caught it, he realized how wrong he was. The thing was too tall, its limbs too long and thin, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. The head was human-like, but the eyes glowed in the firelight, and the mouth was wrong, stretching into a snarl that didn't fit its face. Sarah screamed, and the thing lunged forward. Shadow barked and growled, placing himself between Dean and the creature. Dean swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching the thing's face again before it darted back into the woods. Dean shouted, grabbing Shadow's collar and pulling him toward the trail. They ran, slipping on the muddy ground, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. It wasn't just following, it was circling, its glowing eyes flashing through the trees as if it were toying with them. The storm was in full force now, rain hammering down and turning the dirt trail into a slick mess. Dean could barely see, his flashlight cutting through the darkness just enough to keep him on the path. Shadow barked frantically, pulling against the leash, but Dean held tight. They finally reached the van, fumbling with the keys as the creature closed in. Dean could hear it, feel it, just beyond the edge of the light. The others piled in, and Dean barely managed to slam the door shut before it hit the side of the van with a force that rocked the entire vehicle. "Drive!" Sarah screamed, and Dean didn't hesitate. The van tore out of the campsite, the tires struggling for traction on the muddy road. The creature chased them, its long limbs carrying it unnervingly fast. Dean's hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, his knuckles white as he navigated the twisting back roads. Eventually, the lights of Bladenboro came into view, and the creature vanished into the shadows, as if it couldn't or wouldn't follow them into the town. They parked outside a diner, shaking and soaked to the bone. None of them spoke for a long time, the reality of what they'd seen sinking in. Dean kept glancing back toward the woods, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back. He never wanted to believe in the stories, but now he couldn't forget. The beast of Bladenboro, or whatever it was real, and it was still out there. The Ozark Mountains stretched endlessly before them, their rugged peaks blanketed in vibrant green as spring had fully awakened. The air was fresh, with the faint tang of earth and blooming wildflowers. Keanu Norris eased his truck up a winding road, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires blending with the soft rumble of the engine. His friends, Mia, Jake, and Laura, were in the cab with him, while his dog, Blaze, a lively German shepherd with a sharp nose for trouble, lounged in the truck bed. Keanu was a firefighter from a small town in the Midwest. Growing up in a rural area, he'd spent most of his life hunting in the surrounding woods, which had sharpened his senses and taught him respect for nature's unpredictability. The Ozarks, though, were unfamiliar territory, their dense forests and steep ridges carrying a wildness that felt different from home. He'd heard stories about the area, rumors passed around campfires and in hushed tones at hunting lodges. There were always tales in places like this, strange noises, disappearing livestock, shadows where there shouldn't be. Most of it was probably just legends, but Keanu had learned never to completely discount local lore. The trouble began just after noon. A grinding sound came from beneath the hood, and the truck shuddered violently before rolling to a stop on the side of the dirt road. Keanu cursed under his breath and climbed out to check the engine. The others followed, Blaze hopping down and sniffing the air, his tail wagging. "Well, that's just perfect," Mia muttered, shading her eyes as she looked around. The sky had grown overcast, the clouds hanging low and heavy like a gray blanket. "Do you even know how to fix this thing?" "Maybe," Keanu replied, though the tangled mess of wires and metal under the hood didn't inspire much confidence. Jake wandered a few feet away, peering into the trees. "We're in the middle of nowhere, man," What are we supposed to do if you can't fix it? There's a town a few miles back, Laura said, though her voice was uncertain. Maybe we could walk it? Keanu frowned. He didn't like the idea of leaving the truck, but staying put wasn't much better. They'd been off the main road for hours, and the chances of someone passing by were slim. As he worked, Blaze growled low in his throat. His ears perked. Keanu paused, glancing toward the dog. "What is it, boy?" he asked, but Blaze only stared into the trees, his hackles raised. The first encounter was subtle, almost easy to miss. A flicker of movement in the dense undergrowth, too quick and far away to make out clearly. Keanu straightened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest. The others noticed his unease and fell silent, their own gazes following his. "What did you see?" Mia whispered. "I don't know," Keanu admitted. "Could have been a deer." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't right. There was something about the way it moved, not like an animal, but different, deliberate, watching. They decided to make camp while Keanu tried to piece together a solution for the truck. A fire crackled in a makeshift pit, its smoke curling into the cool, cloudy air. Blaze lay at Keanu's side, though the dog's usual relaxed demeanor was gone. His ears twitched constantly, his eyes darting toward the trees. As night fell, the unease grew. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of insects and birds absent. Keanu's thoughts drifted to his family, to the hunting trips with his father that had taught him how to move silently through the woods, how to track, and how to listen. He remembered his dad's words, "It's not the things you see that'll get you, it's the ones you don't." The attack came just as they were starting to settle in for the night. A low, guttural noise echoed through the woods, followed by a crashing sound as something large barreled through the undergrowth. Blaze leapt to his feet, barking furiously, and the group scrambled for weapons. Pocket knives, branches, anything they could find. Keanu caught a glimpse of it then. A figure just beyond the firelight. Its shape was wrong, humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally smooth. It didn't charge but circled, staying just out of reach, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Stay together," Keanu shouted, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The creature lunged suddenly, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. It grabbed Jake, pulling him toward the trees with a strength that defied reason. The others screamed, and Keanu lunged after it, slashing with his knife, but the thing was too quick. It disappeared into the shadows, taking Jake with it. There was no time to mourn or think. They had to move. Grabbing what they could carry, Keanu led the group down the trail, Blaze at his side. The dog was their only warning, growling whenever the creature came too close. The route out was harrowing. The thing followed them, its glowing eyes appearing and disappearing in the darkness. At one point, it let out a sound that chilled Keanu to the bone. A low, almost human wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They finally stumbled into a small village just as dawn broke, their clothes torn and muddy, their faces pale with exhaustion. The locals stared as they entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Keanu called a friend to come pick them up, but they didn't talk about what had happened. Not then, not to the villagers, and not to the friend who eventually arrived. The story seemed too unbelievable, too insane. But as they left the Ozarks behind, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been lucky to escape at all. He never forgot those glowing eyes or the way the forest seemed to breathe around them, and he never went back to the Ozarks. Spring in Wisconsin is a time of rebirth, the forests coming alive with green canopies and blooming wildflowers. It was the perfect season for a hike, or so David Davidson had thought when he and his friends, Maggie, Tyler, and Lauren, had planned their day trip into the woods. The Kettle Moraine State Forest was known for its rolling hills and lush greenery, a stark contrast to the flat, arid lands of Texas where David grew up. It reminded him of his first spring out of college, when he'd moved to a larger city and taken up a job at the zoo, working with animals most people only saw in documentaries. David was a zookeeper by trade, and a tinkerer by passion. Back in his cramped Texas garage, he had spent countless hours building custom computers, designing rigs for friends, or just losing himself in the hum of circuits and cooling fans. It was a far cry from the woods, but he appreciated the quiet focus both activities required. The hike started as a relaxing escape. They parked near a trailhead and packed their bags with snacks, water, and a couple of folding knives, more for utility than self-defense. The group walked at a leisurely pace, enjoying the fresh air and the occasional bursts of laughter from inside jokes that had carried them through years of friendship. The wind began to pick up in the late afternoon, whispering through the trees with an eerie insistence. Maggie, always the first to notice shifts in atmosphere, commented on how quickly the weather seemed to be changing. Clouds gathered above, and the sound of leaves rustling grew louder, almost drowning out their conversation. David remembered a TV show he'd once seen, a documentary about strange folklore creatures like skinwalkers, shapeshifters rumored to haunt the wilderness. The thought flickered in his mind briefly, but he dismissed it with a shake of his head. This was Wisconsin, not the deserts of Navajo lore. It was Tyler who first noticed something strange. They had stopped at a clearing to rest and share a granola bar, the wind tugging at their jackets and hair. Tyler froze mid-sentence, staring into the forest beyond the clearing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice hushed. The others fell silent, straining to catch whatever sound he had heard. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, came a sound like a low, guttural growl. It was distant yet unmistakably there, threading through the rustle of leaves. "Probably just a coyote," Lauren said, though her tone was more nervous than reassuring. David's instincts kicked in. He'd worked with predators at the zoo and knew their sounds well, but this didn't match anything he was familiar with. It had a strange resonance, almost as if it were mimicking something it didn't fully understand. As they pressed on, unease hung over the group like a storm cloud. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by dense thickets of trees, and the wind seemed to howl in concert with their quickening pace. Then came the noise again, a chilling, almost human-sounding cry that made Maggie clutch David's arm. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. They didn't have to wait long to find out. A shadow darted between the trees, moving faster than anything humanly possible. David caught a glimpse, a humanoid shape, its limbs elongated and its movements jerky and unnatural. The creature let out another cry, louder this time, a noise that seemed to echo from all directions. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged from the shadows, swiping at Lauren. She fell backward with a scream, clutching her leg as blood seeped through her jeans. David and Tyler sprang into action, brandishing their knives and shouting to drive it back. The creature retreated momentarily, its glowing eyes watching them with a predatory intelligence. "We need to get out of here," David said, his voice firm despite the adrenaline surging through him. Lauren could barely stand, and the group decided to set up a fire near a rocky outcrop where they could keep watch. David's mind raced as he helped tend to Lauren's wound. He thought of his parents, of his dad's meticulous way of solving problems, and his mom's quiet resilience. He wished he could call them, but there was no signal out here. Instead, he focused on the fire, its flickering light casting long shadows that seemed to dance mockingly in the trees. The creature didn't stay away for long. They heard it circling, its cries growing closer and more insistent. Blaze-like eyes glinted in the darkness, watching them from the periphery of the firelight. "Why is it just watching us?" Maggie whispered. "Waiting," David said grimly. When dawn broke, they decided they couldn't wait any longer. Lauren, though weak, insisted she could move if they helped her. They abandoned their makeshift camp and moved as quickly as they could toward the car. The creature followed, keeping just out of sight but letting them know it was there. Every now and then, they heard its chilling cries, the sound cutting through the morning air like a knife. By the time they reached the car, the group was on the verge of collapse. David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, as Tyler and Maggie helped Lauren into the back seat. As the engine roared to life, David caught one last glimpse of the creature in the rearview mirror, standing on the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes fixed on them as they sped away. They didn't stop until they reached a gas station miles away. There, they called for help and attended to Lauren's wound more thoroughly. When asked what had happened, they gave vague answers, unwilling to share the full truth. David never forgot the encounter. The creature's cries haunted his dreams, and every time the wind howled, he couldn't help but remember the eyes watching him from the trees. Autumn in Montana was everything Sam Starsky expected it to be. Crimson and gold leaves cascading through the wind, the air crisp and bracing. He had joined the guided hike organized by a travel agency as a chance to unwind from his job back in New Orleans. It was a far cry from the sticky humidity of home. Sam, a police officer by trade, found solace in the vastness of the outdoors, though his hobbies were more sedentary, nights spent watching thrillers and mysteries in the comfort of his apartment. The group was 10 strong, led by a chipper guide named Jessica, who carried a map and a first aid kit with the confidence of someone who had trekked these woods countless times. The group dynamics were lively. Strangers chatted about work, family, and hobbies as the trail wound deeper into the forest. Sam, however, remained quiet, soaking in the scenery while mentally cataloging his fellow hikers. Old habits from the force, perhaps. By mid-afternoon, the sky had grown overcast and a chilly wind stirred the treetops. A distant rumble hinted at an incoming storm. Jessica, ever the professional, suggested they make camp early at a clearing just off the main trail. The group agreed, eager to rest and perhaps roast marshmallows over a fire. Sam noted the shift in the atmosphere. What had felt serene now seemed oppressive. He blamed it on the storm and brushed the feeling aside. As they gathered kindling for the fire, an odd stillness blanketed the forest. Birds that had been chirping earlier were now silent, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. Sam's unease deepened when one of the hikers, a young woman named Clara, returned with a handful of sticks and whispered to him, "I swear I saw something moving in the trees, big but quiet." Sam scanned the tree line but saw nothing. He reassured her it was likely a deer or a bear, though his instincts told him otherwise. He'd read about the Wendigo in a sensationalist tabloid back home, a creature born of starvation and greed, cursed to wander the forest forever. But that was just a story, right? Night fell quickly, and the group huddled around the fire, their laughter and chatter attempting to chase away the growing unease. Jessica shared stories about the forest's history, miners who had gone missing, unexplained howls at night, and other tales meant to thrill. Sam listened, his mind racing back to Clara's words in the eerie quiet of the woods. Then it came, a sound that made the entire group freeze, a low guttural growl, too deep to be human, but too deliberate to be animal. It echoed through the clearing, reverberating off the trees. The firelight seemed dimmer, and the shadows stretched unnaturally. Jessica stood, her flashlight scanning the perimeter. "Probably just a bear," she said, though her voice wavered. "Everyone stay close to the fire." The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a rustling that circled the clearing. Sam's hand instinctively went to his pocket knife, though it felt pitifully inadequate. The group clustered together, their bravado gone. Clara whimpered softly, and another hiker, a burly man named Mike, muttered, "What the hell is out there?" The answer came in a blur. A hulking shape darted between the trees, too fast to get a good look. It seemed to be toying with them, its movements deliberate and calculated. Sam's heart pounded as he caught a glimpse. A gaunt, elongated face with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. It wasn't human, but it moved on two legs, its limbs unnaturally long. Jessica commanded, her voice breaking. The group obeyed, abandoning the fire as they fled into the woods. Sam brought up the rear, his eyes darting in every direction. He could hear it following them, its heavy breathing mingling with the hikers' panicked footsteps. The trail was barely visible under the canopy of trees, and the group stumbled more than once. The creature was relentless, crashing through the underbrush, and letting out a bone-chilling shriek that sent adrenaline coursing through Sam's veins. Clara tripped and fell, scraping her knee. Sam and Mike hauled her up, the three of them falling behind the others. "Keep moving," Sam barked, his voice filled with authority. His mind raced with possibilities. Fight or flight? Could they even fight something like this? The forest finally began to thin, and the dim outline of the trailhead came into view. Sam urged Clara forward, his knife clenched tightly in his hand. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting roar, as if angered by their imminent escape. Sam turned, ready to face it, but it didn't follow them out of the woods. It lingered at the tree line, its glowing eyes watching as they scrambled into their cars. Back in the safety of their vehicles, the group sat in stunned silence. Sam's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. Jessica tried to reassure everyone, but her words fell flat. No one called the police. It seemed futile to explain what they had seen. Instead, they drove away, each of them carrying the memory of those glowing eyes and the guttural growls that would haunt their dreams. Sam couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had let them go, as if the chase had been enough to satisfy its twisted hunger. As he sped down the highway, he resolved never to dismiss the folklore in those yellowed tabloids again. Some stories, it seemed, were rooted in truths too terrifying to comprehend. Winter in Michigan's Upper Peninsula is no joke. Snow blankets the land so thickly that even sound feels muffled under its weight. Norris and his group of friends had decided to brave it for a camping trip, a sort of winter adventure to break the monotony of their work lives. Norris, an IT specialist from Tennessee, rarely got out of the house except for errands or the occasional coffee run. His passion was building custom computers, and his weekends were usually spent tweaking configurations or trying out new hardware. But this trip was supposed to be different, a chance to unplug and reconnect with nature. They'd set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The trees here were skeletal in winter, their bare branches reaching skyward like claws. The group was 5 strong: Nora, an avid hiker; Ben, who always carried a hunting knife; Heather, who insisted on bringing her fancy DSLR camera; and Greg, the self-proclaimed survival expert. They were all bundled in layers, their breath visible in the frigid air. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully, though Norris couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so. The kind of quiet where even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the stillness. He chalked it up to nerves. After all, he wasn't exactly an outdoorsman. But on the 3rd night, things took a turn. They were sitting around the campfire, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the biting cold. The flames danced in Heather's eyes as she reviewed the photos she'd taken during the day. Greg was telling a story about a time he'd nearly gotten lost in the woods, his voice carrying easily in the calm air. Then, just as Norris was starting to relax, there was a sound. It was faint at first, a low crunch of snow underfoot. Norris froze, his eyes darting to the edge of the clearing. The others noticed his tension, and Greg paused mid-sentence. The sound came again, louder this time, circling the camp as if something or someone was stalking them. "Probably just a deer," Ben said, though his hand instinctively went to the knife at his hip. But Norris wasn't convinced. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy for a deer. "Maybe we should check it out," Greg suggested, but Heather shook her head. "Are you insane? Let it be." The group fell silent, the fire crackling loudly in the absence of their voices. Norris scanned the tree line, his mind racing. He remembered a show he'd seen about the Rougarou, a creature from Native American lore. It was said to be a man cursed to roam the woods, consumed by an insatiable hunger. The thought made his skin crawl, but he dismissed it. Legends didn't haunt the woods. Real animals did. And yet, the feeling of being watched persisted. Hours passed, and though the sounds ceased, the group remained on edge. They decided to turn in, but sleep was elusive. Norris lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Every rustle of fabric, every shift in the wind set his heart racing. Just as he was starting to drift off, a piercing scream cut through the night. He bolted upright, his breath hitching. The scream was inhuman, a guttural wail that echoed through the forest. The others scrambled out of their tents, their faces pale with fear. "What the hell was that?" Nora whispered. No one had an answer. Greg lit a lantern and the group huddled close, their fear palpable. Then, from the edge of the clearing, they saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the firelight. They were too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal. The creature moved, stepping just close enough to reveal a gaunt, elongated figure before retreating back into the shadows. "It's just messing with us," Greg muttered, his bravado faltering. They decided to keep the fire burning and stay awake. Norris couldn't shake the image of the creature from his mind. It had been humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally fluid. He thought about the Rugaru again, about the warnings in the TV show. Never make eye contact, never let it know you're afraid. The next morning, the group decided to pack up and leave. The creature hadn't shown itself again, but they could hear it circling the camp, its footsteps crunching through the snow. As they trudged back to the trailhead, the calm weather felt mocking. The sun was weak, barely piercing the overcast sky, and the air was deathly still. Then it attacked. The creature lunged out of the trees, knocking Greg to the ground. Ben slashed at it with his knife, but it moved too quickly, retreating before he could land a hit. Greg scrambled to his feet, his face pale but otherwise unhurt. The group broke into a run, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they raced toward the car. Norris's mind was a blur. He thought of his family back home, of his younger sister who used to drag him to horror movies he hated but secretly enjoyed. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. When they finally reached the car, they piled in, slamming the doors behind them. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes watching as they sped away. No one spoke during the drive back, the weight of what they'd experienced settling over them like a shroud. Norris never told anyone about the trip. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him. But every winter, when the snow blanketed the ground and the forest grew quiet, he couldn't help but remember the glowing eyes and the scream that still haunted his dreams. The wind was strong that autumn in Montana, howling through the valleys and rattling the windows of the little rental cabin where Kurt Stallone and his travel group were staying. Kurt, an MMA fighter from Chicago, had never been one for rural getaways, but his manager insisted that this trip was a good way to decompress. He'd agreed reluctantly, figuring a weekend away from the city might not be so bad. Besides, it gave him time to brainstorm a new paint scheme for his Warhammer 40K army, a hobby he rarely talked about, but took very seriously. The trip was organized by a local travel agency, promising a mix of hiking, stargazing, and campfire storytelling. Their cabin was nestled in a wooded area, surrounded by towering pines and miles of empty wilderness. It was the kind of place where the silence pressed down on you, that only occasionally broken by the rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. The group consisted of 6 people, including Kurt. There was Amanda, a nature photographer, Mike and Rachel, a couple celebrating their anniversary, Tom, the group leader from the travel agency, and Sophia, a quiet woman who worked in marketing. They'd spent the day hiking through the woods, marveling at the vibrant reds and yellows of the leaves. The wind picked up as evening fell, carrying a sharp chill that sent everyone hurrying back to the cabin. Kurt noticed it first as they unpacked by the fire, a feeling, a sense that they weren't alone. He brushed it off at first. Growing up in Chicago, he was used to being hyper-aware of his surroundings, always on edge. But this felt different. After dinner, they sat around the fire pit outside, sharing stories. The wind whipped through the trees, making the flames dance erratically. Tom told a local legend about skinwalkers, beings from Native American folklore that could take on the appearance of animals or even people. Kurt listened with mild interest, though he wasn't one to buy into superstitions. He'd heard whispers about such creatures before, rumors in internet forums and sensationalized TV shows. It started with a sound, a low, guttural growl carried on the wind. Amanda paused mid-sentence, her eyes darting to the tree line. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Probably just a coyote," Tom said, though his voice wavered. Kurt stood, scanning the darkness. The firelight barely reached the edge of the clearing, and beyond that was an impenetrable wall of shadows. He saw nothing but felt everything, a presence, heavy and malevolent, watching them. The growl came again, closer this time. The group huddled together, their faces pale in the firelight. "Let's get inside," Tom said finally, his usual bravado gone. They retreated to the cabin, locking the doors and pulling the curtains shut. Kurt kept glancing out the window, his fists clenched. He'd faced down opponents in the ring who were twice his size, but this was different. Whatever was out there wasn't human. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scrape against the back door. "Is someone out there?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Kurt grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, his muscles tense. "Stay here," he said. "No way," Mike protested, but Kurt shook his head. "I'm not asking." He opened the door slowly, stepping onto the back porch. The wind whipped his hair as he scanned the darkness. The scratching had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He turned back toward the cabin and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Kurt's breath caught in his throat as the figure tilted its head, as if studying him. Then it vanished into the trees, moving with an unnatural speed. He backed into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. "What was it?" Amanda asked. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But it's not friendly." The group stayed awake, huddled in the living room. Kurt kept the fire poker close, his eyes darting to the windows. The wind didn't let up, and every creak of the cabin made them jump. Just before dawn, it attacked. The creature crashed through the front window, a blur of claws and teeth. It went straight for Tom, dragging him outside before anyone could react. The group screamed, scattering in panic. Kurt grabbed the nearest weapon, a hunting knife from Tom's pack, and followed the creature outside. The clearing was empty, save for the blood in the snow. Kurt's heart pounded as he turned back to the cabin. "We have to get to the car," he said, his voice firm. "Now." The group sprinted through the woods, the creature's growls echoing around them. It was toying with them, letting them think they had a chance. Sophia tripped, falling hard onto the frozen ground. Kurt hauled her to her feet, his grip like iron. "Keep moving," he barked. The car came into view, its metal frame glinting faintly in the pre-dawn light. They piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the creature emerged from the trees. It stood there, its glowing eyes locked on them before retreating into the shadows. No one spoke as they drove away, the weight of what had happened settling over them. Kurt stared out the window, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't believe in legends or folklore, but whatever that thing was, it wasn't a story. It was real. The wind had been picking up steadily all day, and by the time we reached the old gas station on the edge of a dense stretch of woods in Maine, it was howling. The trees bowed and swayed, their fiery orange and red leaves scattering across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Rex, my German shepherd, sat upright in the back seat of the SUV, ears pricked and nose twitching as he scanned the landscape. We'd been driving for hours. Me and my two closest friends, Marcus and Emily. The trip was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to unwind before the holiday rush. I'd brought Rex along because, frankly, I trusted his instincts better than my own sometimes. A zookeeper in Boston, I'd spent years working with animals, and Rex had been my companion through it all, his keen awareness saving me more than once during training runs in the city's parks. The gas station looked ancient, its peeling paint and creaky wooden sign barely visible in the dim autumn light. As I filled the tank, Marcus went inside for snacks, and Emily stayed by the car, scrolling through her phone. The wind was colder than I'd expected, and I tugged my jacket tighter. Then Rex growled. It wasn't his usual bark, the one he used for delivery drivers or squirrels. This was low and guttural, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I followed his gaze to the woods beyond the station. At first, I saw nothing, just the swaying trees and shadows that danced with the wind. But then, between two trunks, something moved. It was subtle, just a shift of dark against dark. But it was enough. I froze, my hand tightening on the gas pump handle. Rex growled again, his teeth bared. "What is it?" Emily asked, looking up. "Stay by the car," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Marcus returned, a bag of chips in one hand and a confused look on his face. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I said, still staring at the woods. "But something's out there." The wind carried a faint sound, a rustling, then a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. Whatever it wasn't small. We hurried back into the car and I started the engine. As we pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. But then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows. "Did you see that?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "I don't know what I saw," I replied, gripping the wheel. We drove in tense silence for a while, the wind buffeting the car and the woods pressing close on either side of the narrow road. Rex didn't relax, his ears still alert and his gaze fixed on the windows. When the road led us to a small clearing with a fire pit and a picnic table, we decided to stop and regroup. The gas station encounter had left us all on edge, but we tried to laugh it off, joking about horror movies and urban legends. The fire crackled as we sat around it, the warmth a welcome relief from the biting wind. It was Emily who brought up the local folklore. "They say Maine is full of weird stuff," she said, poking the fire with a stick. "Ghosts, cryptids, werewolves even." "Werewolves?" Marcus scoffed. "Yeah," Emily said. "I read about it online. Some locals claim they've seen green creatures in the woods. Big, fast, and not entirely human." I didn't say anything, but her words stuck with me. Years ago, I'd read something similar in one of those sensationalist magazines you find in waiting rooms. At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now, I wasn't so sure. Rex stood suddenly, his ears flat against his head. The fur along his spine bristled. "What is it, boy?" I asked, rising to my feet. The wind carried a sound again, closer this time. A growl, low and menacing, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves. We killed the fire and doused the embers, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The shadows in the woods seemed to shift and ripple, as if something massive was circling us. As we made our way back to the car, the creature emerged from the tree line, just for a moment. It was huge, its body covered in dark fur, its eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. It didn't charge, didn't roar, it simply watched, its posture low and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. We moved faster, Rex growling and snapping at the air as if trying to ward it off. The creature didn't follow us directly, but we could hear it, always just out of sight, stalking us through the underbrush. By the time we reached the car, my hands were shaking. We piled in, and I hit the gas, the tires spinning briefly before catching the gravel. The road back to town felt endless, the woods pressing in on all sides. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a potential threat. We didn't stop until we were back at the gas station, its familiar, dilapidated sign a strange comfort. Only then did I call the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't just a story. Spring in the Appalachians was meant to be tranquil. The ridges stretched endlessly, their peaks dotted with the fresh green of new leaves. The travel agency had promised an unforgettable retreat, a remote cabin tucked into the woods, perfect for recharging from the grind of everyday life. For Viggo Wick, who had come all the way from Boulder, the idea of leaving his retail job behind for a few days seemed too good to pass up. Viggo had always loved the wilderness. Back home, when he wasn't working, he spent weekends hunting in the Rockies, navigating dense forests, and tracking deer with the ease of someone who knew how to read the land. That familiarity was part of why this trip appealed to him. And to his surprise, the Appalachian woods carried a different kind of beauty, a softer, more ancient feel than the rugged terrain he knew back home. The first few days passed uneventfully. Vigo and the small group of travelers explored trails, shared meals around the fire, and marveled at how the mountains seemed to roll forever into the horizon. The cabin they stayed in was rustic but comfortable, and the cool, windy spring nights were perfect for stories and laughter under a blanket of stars. It wasn't until the third night that things began to change. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters of the cabin as the group huddled around the fire pit outside. Someone had just finished telling a ghost story, and the mood was light, filled with laughter and the occasional teasing scare. Vigo had been leaning back in his chair, letting the warmth of the flames seep into his bones, when a noise cut through the night. It was faint at first, a low, guttural growl, carried on the wind like a whisper. Everyone froze, their laughter dying instantly. "Did you hear that?" someone asked, their voice barely above a murmur. Vigo sat up, his senses immediately on edge. He'd heard something similar before back in Colorado, but there was an unfamiliar quality to this sound, something that made his skin crawl. "It's probably just a coyote," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. The group exchanged uneasy glances, and one by one, they began retreating to the safety of the cabin. Vigo lingered by the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flickering light. The woods seemed different now, the trees looming taller and the shadows deeper. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a dark figure crouched low to the ground, almost indistinguishable from the undergrowth. But as Vigo's eyes adjusted, he caught the faint glint of eyeshine, like twin pinpricks of light staring back at him. He didn't move, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The figure shifted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Vigo thought he could make out the silhouette of a large wolf-like creature. But its movements were wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. The growl came again, louder this time, and Vigo's heart pounded in his chest. He took a slow step back, keeping his eyes on the creature as he moved toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and joined the others, who were already on edge. They tried to rationalize what he'd seen, a bear maybe, or a large dog that had wandered too far from home. But Vigo couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else. That night, none of them slept well. The next day, they found tracks in the soft earth near the fire pit. They were massive, resembling paw prints, but with an unsettlingly human-like quality. Vigo thought back to an article he'd read years ago in one of those yellow newspapers, the kind that talked about UFO sightings and cryptid legends. It had mentioned something about dogman sightings in the Midwest and Appalachians. At the time, he dismissed it as nonsense. Now, he wasn't so sure. As the day wore on, the unease grew. The group stayed close to the cabin, their laughter and conversations replaced by nervous glances and whispered speculations. By late afternoon, one of the travelers, a man named Eric, wandered too far into the woods and didn't come back. A search party was organized, but the forest seemed to swallow sound, their calls for Eric fading into the wind. Vigo found himself leading the group, his hunting experience making him the most capable in the situation. Night fell quickly, and with it came the howling wind. The group returned to the cabin, their fear palpable. Vigo stayed by the window, watching the tree line as the others huddled together in the living room. Just before midnight, there was a sound at the door. A soft, deliberate scratching. Vigo motioned for silence, his knife in hand as he approached. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and fear. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the growls outside grew more frequent. By morning, it was clear they couldn't stay. The group packed quickly, their plan to head to the nearest town on foot since their car batteries had mysteriously drained overnight. They moved quietly through the woods, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. But they weren't alone. The creature followed them, its presence a constant, oppressive weight. They caught glimpses of it, a flash of fur, the glint of eyes, but it never attacked outright. It was toying with them, driving them deeper into panic. By the time they reached the outskirts of a small village, the group was exhausted and terrified. Vigo turned to look back at the woods one last time and thought he saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them with an almost human intelligence. They reported what had happened to the locals, who listened with grim expressions. One old man nodded knowingly and muttered something about the dogman, an ancient guardian of the forest, or perhaps something far darker. Vigo never returned to the Appalachians, but he never forgot the creature either. The story I'm about to tell you was shared with me by a man who swore it was true. It happened to his friend Arnold Smith, a Boston police officer who knew his way around tough situations and had the scars to prove it. Arnold loved two things: fixing cars and the open road. Whenever he could, he'd pack up his old truck and take off with his dog, Buck. Buck was a sturdy German Shepherd mix with an energy that mirrored Arnold's relentless drive. This particular spring, Arnold decided to head west, aiming for a quiet few days exploring Wisconsin. The forest there had always intrigued him, vast, sprawling, and ancient in a way that made you feel small. It started innocently enough. Arnold, Buck, and a small group of friends from the Midwest were on a casual road trip. They stopped at a remote gas station off a lonely stretch of road to refuel and grab some snacks. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but never quite delivered, casting a pale gray light over everything. The gas station attendant was an older man, gruff but friendly, with the kind of face that had seen too much. When Arnold mentioned they were heading into the woods to camp for a few days, the man's expression shifted. "Be careful out there," he said, almost absently as he wiped his hands on an old rag. Arnold raised an eyebrow. "Something we should know?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Just don't go too deep. Folks around here hear things." The comment stuck with Arnold, but he didn't mention it to the others. They were in good spirits as they left the station and made their way to a secluded camping spot deep in the woods. The first day passed without incident. The group set up camp, explored nearby trails, and took turns keeping the fire stoked as the evening chill set in. Arnold loved moments like this, the simplicity of it all. He'd grown up in a tight-knit family where nights around the fire had been a cherished tradition, and memories of those times often resurfaced during trips like these. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It was Buck who noticed it first. The dog had been lying by the fire, his ears twitching occasionally at the sounds of the forest. But then he stiffened, his head snapping toward the darkness beyond the trees. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and the fur along his back bristled. Arnold followed Buck's gaze, but saw nothing. "Probably a deer," he muttered, though the unease in his voice was clear. The others dismissed it, but Buck wouldn't settle. He paced the edge of the camp, his growls growing more frequent. Arnold decided to stay up a little later, keeping an eye on things while the others went to their tents. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Arnold stood, his hand instinctively resting on the knife at his belt. The figure moved again, and this time he caught a clearer look. It was tall, impossibly so, and covered in dark fur that seemed to blend into the shadows. It moved with a strange, deliberate gait, almost as if it were trying to mimic human movements, but not quite getting it right. Arnold's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen something like this before, not in person, but on one of those late-night TV shows that covered urban legends and cryptid sightings. Bigfoot. The creature didn't attack right away. It circled the camp, staying just out of reach of the firelight. Arnold's heart raced as he tried to decide what to do. If it was what he thought, they were in serious trouble. Then Buck charged. The dog barked furiously, sprinting into the trees before Arnold could stop him. There was a sound, a deafening roar that echoed through the forest, and then silence. "Buck!" Arnold shouted, running toward the noise. He found the dog a few yards away, limping back toward him with a deep gash across his side. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but Arnold could feel it watching. He got Buck back to camp, his hands shaking as he cleaned the wound. The others woke up, and panic spread quickly as Arnold explained what had happened. They decided they couldn't stay. Gathering what they could, the group left the fire burning and moved as quickly as possible through the woods. The creature followed them, its presence a constant, oppressive weight. Occasionally, they heard it, heavy footsteps snapping branches or low, guttural sounds that sent shivers down their spines. They tried calling for help, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. One of the group members, a man named Jerry, lagged behind and let out a scream that was abruptly cut off. They didn't see him again. Arnold led the group, his mind racing as he tried to remember the layout of the area from the map they'd studied earlier. The cloudy sky made it hard to navigate, but he trusted his instincts, keeping them moving toward what he hoped was the direction of the nearest village. The final stretch was the worst. The creature grew bolder, charging at them from the shadows, but never fully committing to an attack. It was as if it wanted to scare them, to drive them into complete panic. When they finally stumbled out of the woods and into the outskirts of a small village, they collapsed in exhaustion. Arnold looked back once, expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. The locals listened to their story with grim expressions. One old man nodded knowingly. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "Not everyone does." Arnold never went back to Wisconsin. He still dreams about that trip sometimes, about the shadows in the trees and the thing that watched them from the darkness. Buck recovered, but the dog was never quite the same after that night. And Arnold? He no longer doubts the stories about what lurks in the woods. The leaves in the Appalachians were a fiery mosaic, swaying gently in the chilly breeze of early autumn. Nick Mortensen had always heard about the breathtaking beauty of this place, and now, driving along winding roads, flanked by towering trees, he could see it for himself. Beside him in the cab of his battered pickup truck sat Duke, his Labrador mix, staring out the window with his tongue lolling. Nick had rescued Duke from a shelter 3 years ago, and the two had been inseparable ever since. Nick wasn't a stranger to road trips. Growing up in Miami, he'd spent much of his free time either fixing cars or driving them. He loved the controlled chaos of the engine and the freedom the open road brought. Miami's tropical humidity seemed a world away now, replaced by the crispness of fall air that carried the faint scent of pine and decay. He'd planned this trip to escape the relentless pace of his job as a firefighter. The long nights and constant adrenaline were wearing him thin. He needed peace, solitude, and maybe a little adventure. But he couldn't have known the kind of adventure he was driving toward. By dusk, Nick had found a secluded campsite deep in the woods. The clearing was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. He pitched his tent and got a fire going while Duke sniffed around the perimeter, wagging his tail as if this were just another night. Nick sat by the fire, chewing on a granola bar, his mind wandering to his family back in Miami. His father, a mechanic, had taught him everything he knew about cars. His mother, ever the worrier, had never understood his need for adventure. "You'll find trouble if you keep looking for it," she used to say. He chuckled at the memory. The weather had taken a turn. The breeze had picked up, and the skies were growing heavy with storm clouds. He knew it would rain soon, but he wasn't too concerned. His gear was waterproof, and he figured he'd ride out the storm snug in his tent. As darkness fell, Duke's behavior shifted. The dog became restless, his ears twitching at sounds Nick couldn't hear. He barked once, sharply, staring into the trees. Nick stood, peering into the blackness beyond the firelight. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, reaching for the flashlight strapped to his pack. Sweeping the beam of light across the forest, Nick saw nothing but trees and undergrowth. Yet an uneasy feeling settled over him, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing on his back. He shook it off. He'd camped alone before, and the woods always came alive at night. Animals moved, branches snapped, and the mind played tricks. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling as he climbed into his tent, Duke curling up at his feet. Sometime in the middle of the night, Nick woke with a start. Thunder growled in the distance, and rain pattered against the canvas of his tent. But it wasn't the storm that had roused him, it was Duke. The dog was growling low and deep, his body rigid as he stared at the tent flap. Nick grabbed his knife and unzipped the flap just enough to peer outside. The fire had dimmed to glowing embers, but in its faint light he saw something move. A shadow, tall and lean, gliding between the trees. He froze, his heart hammering. The figure was humanoid, but its movements were wrong. Too fluid, too silent. It stopped, and for a moment Nick thought it was staring right at him. Then it disappeared into the darkness. Nick zipped the tent shut and sat back, his mind racing. He'd seen something like this on a TV show about cryptids years ago, a creature called the Rougarou. The show had described it as a cunning predator capable of stalking its prey for days and warned against looking directly into its eyes, as it was said to have hypnotic powers. The next day passed in tense anticipation. Nick stayed close to the campsite, reluctant to venture far. Duke's unease hadn't diminished, and Nick could feel the weight of something unseen lingering in the air. That night, the creature came closer. It started with faint noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching. Then, as Nick sat by the fire, he caught glimpses of it in the flickering light. It was gaunt but powerful, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with a predator's grace, circling the campsite like a wolf herding its prey. Nick clutched his knife, his other hand gripping the handle of a hatchet. Duke barked furiously, the sound echoing through the trees. The creature stopped, tilting its head in an eerily human gesture, before retreating into the shadows. Nick knew he couldn't stay. At first light, he packed up what he could and started toward his truck. The rain had turned the forest floor to mud, and progress was slow. Duke stayed close, his ears flat against his head. The creature didn't wait long to follow. It stayed just out of sight, its presence betrayed by the occasional rustle or snapped branch. Once, it darted across the trail ahead of them, its speed so unnatural that Nick barely registered the movement. When they finally reached the truck, Nick threw his gear into the bed and Duke into the passenger seat. He started the engine, the sound loud and jarring in the stillness. As he pulled onto the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw it standing at the edge of the forest, watching him. Nick didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town. He called his sister, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. She didn't believe him, of course, but she promised to let their parents know he was safe. He never went back to the Appalachians. Whatever was out there, he didn't want to know. And he never forgot the way the creature had looked at him, as if it were deciding whether to let him go. The Pacific Northwest was everything Arthur Davidson had hoped it would be. Towering evergreens, air so fresh it was almost intoxicating, and a misty beauty that clung to the landscape like a shroud. The winding roads leading into the heart of the wilderness were a stark contrast to the sun-baked flatlands of Mississippi, where Arthur had grown up. He liked to joke that he'd traded cicadas and magnolias for moss and mystery. Arthur wasn't alone on this trip. He'd come with 3 friends from his college days, Chris, Danielle, and Mateo. The 4 of them had planned this camping trip for months. It was meant to be a break from their chaotic lives. Chris was an overworked graphic designer, Danielle, a grad student buried in research, and Mateo, a contractor who hadn't taken a vacation in years. Then there was Arthur, a cook by trade, who had developed a side hobby of building custom computers. He was known for his precision, whether in seasoning a dish or assembling a gaming rig, and he'd brought along his dog, Bolt, a German Shepherd mix with a boundless curiosity that often got him into trouble. Their campsite was nestled deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. It had taken them hours to hike in, carrying supplies on their backs, but the payoff was worth it. The clearing was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and a crystal clear stream nearby. They spent their first evening setting up camp and swapping stories around the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows against the trees. By the second day, the sense of isolation had deepened. The woods seemed to press in on them. the dense foliage muting every sound. Even the birdsong felt distant. Arthur couldn't shake a creeping unease, though he chalked it up to being so far from civilization. Bolt, however, seemed to sense something. He would perk up his ears and stare into the forest, his body tense. Arthur tried to reassure him, scratching behind his ears and murmuring, "It's just squirrels, buddy. Nothing to worry about." That night, the feeling grew stronger. Snow wouldn't come to the Pacific Northwest in the summer, of course, but a chilling wind swept through the forest, biting even through their jackets. The fire crackled in defiance of the cold, and the group huddled closer to it, their laughter quieter than the night before. "Ever hear about the skinwalker?" Arthur asked, trying to lighten the mood with a spooky story. Chris groaned. "Don't start." "No, seriously," Arthur pressed. "I read about it. People have reported seeing things out here. Animals that aren't animals. People who aren't people." "Stop," Danielle said, throwing a marshmallow at him. "We're in the middle of nowhere, and you're going to jinx us." But Arthur wasn't joking. He'd read about skinwalkers, beings from Navajo legend capable of shifting forms and mimicking voices to lure their prey. He'd dismissed the stories as folklore, but now, with Bolt growling softly at the edge of the clearing, he wasn't so sure. Later that night, long after the fire had burned low, Arthur was woken by Bolt's frantic barking. He sat up, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. "What is it, boy?" Bolt was staring into the forest, his fur bristling. Arthur grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. At first, he saw nothing. Then, just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. It was a shape, tall, lean, and wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its movements unnaturally smooth. For a moment, it stepped into the light, and Arthur's breath caught. It looked like a deer, but its eyes were too human, its posture too upright. Then it disappeared into the darkness. Arthur's mind raced. The skinwalker stories came flooding back. He didn't know what to do. If the legends were true, there was no fighting it. The next morning, the group decided to pack up. "We're not staying out here another night," Danielle said, her face pale. But the creature didn't wait for nightfall. As they hiked back toward the road, it followed them. Sometimes they'd hear it, branches snapping, footsteps crunching. Other times, they'd catch glimpses of it, moving too fast to be natural. At one point, Bolt lunged toward the trees, barking furiously. Arthur had to drag him back, his hands trembling. "We need to run," Mateo said. They dropped their gear and sprinted, the forest blurring around them. Arthur kept Bolt close, the dog's frantic barking urging him on. Behind them, the creature gave chase, its movements eerily silent despite its speed. When they burst onto the main road, gasping for breath, a pickup truck was coming down the asphalt. Arthur flagged it down, shouting and waving his arms. The driver, a burly man in a flannel shirt, slammed on the brakes. "Get in," he shouted. They piled into the truck bed, and Arthur barely had time to pull Bolt in before the driver took off. As they sped away, Arthur looked back and saw the creature standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. They reached the nearest town and called the police, though Arthur doubted they could do anything. The creature wasn't something you could arrest or shoot. It was older than that, something tied to the land and its secrets. Arthur didn't sleep that night. He couldn't shake the image of those human eyes staring out of an animal's face. He'd come to the Pacific Northwest for adventure, but he'd found something else entirely, and he knew he'd never go back. The rain began as a drizzle as we pulled into the gas station, a quiet, unassuming spot tucked along a winding road in the Ozark Mountains. The green canopy of the forest loomed around us, the mist curling between the trees like something alive. I glanced at the bus windows, fogging from the dampness outside, and tried not to let the unease settle too deep in my chest. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm a park ranger from San Francisco, though you wouldn't guess it from looking at me. Most people think city life doesn't breed hunters, but the wilderness surrounding the Bay Area is full of opportunities if you know where to look. I'd spent weekends with my dad, tracking deer and learning the patience it takes to live in the woods. Maybe that's why I felt the first prick of unease before anyone else. The travel agency's trip was supposed to be a simple day hike through the Ozarks, a chance to experience the rugged beauty of the mountains. The group was a mix of couples, families, and solo travelers, all eager for the promise of fresh air and scenic views. We stopped at the gas station to stock up on snacks, stretch our legs, and wait out the rain. I stepped off the bus, pulling my hood up as the drizzle intensified. The air was thick, with the earthy scent of wet pine and soil. It reminded me of childhood mornings in the forest, calm but alive with the possibility of something unseen. Behind the gas station was a patch of trees that stretched into the wilderness. As I leaned against the side of the bus, sipping from a bottle of water, I caught a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow slipping between the trees. But then I saw it, a figure hunched low behind a tree, its shape obscured but undeniably there. My instincts kicked in, the same ones that had kept me safe on countless hunting trips. Someone or something was watching us. "Hey, Dan," a man from the group called out, breaking my focus. "You good?" "Yeah," I replied, forcing a grin, just stretching my legs. But I wasn't good. My heart was pounding, and my hand itched to reach for the knife I always carried on hikes. Like the figure didn't move. It stayed there, half hidden, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as if studying us. I told myself it was probably a local, maybe a hunter curious about the busload of tourists. But deep down, I knew better. The way it stayed perfectly still, even as the rain fell harder, it wasn't human. By the time we boarded the bus again, the unease had spread through the group. People were quieter, their laughter subdued. We drove deeper into the mountains by the rain, turning the dirt roads into slick ribbons of mud. The hike itself was supposed to be straightforward, a loop trail leading to a waterfall. But as we made our way into the forest, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I didn't mention what I'd seen at the gas station. No point in spooking everyone. The first encounter came as we reached the halfway point of the trail. The rain had let up, but the forest was still drenched, the ground slick and the air heavy with humidity. We gathered near a rocky outcrop to rest, some of the group lighting a small fire to warm themselves. I wandered to the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it again. The same figure, now closer. It was partially obscured by a thick trunk, but I could make out more details. The broad shoulders, the long limbs, and the glint of eyes that caught the faint light of the fire. "Dan," a voice called behind me. I turned sharply. "Stay by the fire," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. The creature didn't move. It just stared, its presence heavy and oppressive. I thought of an article I'd read in a hunting magazine a few months back about sightings of dogmen in the Midwest. A cryptid with the body of a man and the head of a dog, known for stalking its prey and toying with them before attacking. When the creature finally moved, it was with an unnatural fluidity, slipping behind the trees like a shadow. That night, we didn't make it back to the bus. The rain returned in full force, drenching the forest and making it impossible to navigate. We built a fire to keep warm, though it did little to ease the tension. People whispered about the strange noises, branches snapping, footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. Around midnight, the creature made its move. It howled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. The group panicked, grabbing whatever they could as weapons. I held my knife tightly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. It darted into the firelight once, just long enough for me to see its face. The elongated snout, the sharp teeth, and those unblinking eyes. "Run!" I shouted. We abandoned the campfire, sprinting through the rain-soaked forest. The creature chased us, its footsteps unnervingly silent despite its size. A branch snapped near me, and I turned to see one of the group fall. I reached for them, but it was too late. The creature dragged them into the darkness, their screams echoing through the trees. By dawn, only 4 of us made it to the edge of the forest. The rain had stopped, and the main road was visible through the thinning trees. A small village lay beyond, its lights a beacon of safety. We stumbled into town, soaked and shivering. No one spoke about what had happened, not to the locals and not to each other. What could we say? That something inhuman had hunted us through the Ozarks? I'll never forget the look in its eyes. Intelligent, predatory, and far too human. The summer heat in Bladenboro, North Carolina was oppressive. A golden sun cast long shadows across the dense forests, a stark contrast to the sprawling flatlands that Viggo Larsen had grown up around in Denver. His days off as an ambulance driver were usually spent fishing along the Front Range, relishing the solitude the sport provided. But this trip was supposed to be different. A change of pace, a chance to reconnect with old friends and leave the chaos of his job behind for a few nights. They were a group of 6. Viggo, his childhood friends Emily and Jake, and 3 of Emily's acquaintances. The plan was simple, a road trip with stops at obscure towns and forgotten trails, their temporary home being a rustic cabin deep in the woods near Bladenboro. Viggo had heard rumors about the area, strange whispers about a creature that stalked the forests at night, but he had dismissed them. Folklore was just a part of small-town charm, after all. On the second evening, they built a fire behind the cabin. The air was warm, cicadas humming in the distance. They shared stories, laughed, and sipped beer, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the tree line. Viggo couldn't shake the feeling that the woods seemed too quiet. The distant calls of owls were absent, and even the insects seemed muted. Emily was the first to point out the smell, a heavy, metallic tang mixed with the musk of decay wafted through the clearing. Jake joked that someone had left food out too long, but Viggo's gut told him otherwise. He remembered his dad's words from when they used to hunt together. When something smells dead, something alive isn't far behind. Later that night, Viggo couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, gazing at the dark forest under a cloudless, star-speckled sky. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Then it stepped into the moonlight, a hulking figure, half hidden behind a tree. The shape of its body was almost human, but the elongated limbs and unnaturally angular posture sent a chill down his spine. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like distant embers. Viggo's breath caught in his throat. He thought of the stories. Locals called it the Beast of Bladenboro, a werewolf-like creature infamous for livestock killings in the 1950s. His father had mentioned it once, laughing at the absurdity of it, but here it was, staring back at him. He retreated inside, locking the door as quietly as possible. By the time he roused the others, the creature was gone. They laughed nervously at his story, attributing it to too much beer or an overactive imagination. But Viggo knew better. He stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the hunting knife he'd brought along for the trip. The next day passed uneventfully, though Viggo's unease never lifted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they prepared for another night around the fire. This time, everyone was on edge, the eerie silence of the forest pressing in on them. Emily suggested they turn in early, but Viggo insisted they stay together. It was safer that way. The attack came without warning. The firelight flickered as a low growl echoed from the trees. Viggo stood, scanning the darkness, knife in hand. Then it lunged, a blur of fur and claws. Jake screamed as the creature tackled him to the ground, its jaws snapping inches from his face. Viggo and another friend, Tyler, charged, swinging knives and a heavy branch they'd grabbed in desperation. The beast snarled, a guttural primal sound that vibrated through Viggo's chest. The fight was chaos. Blood sprayed as Jake slashed wildly, landing a lucky hit on the creature's shoulder. It recoiled, emitting a howl that made Viggo's ears ring. For a moment it seemed unsure, its glowing eyes darting between them and the woods. Then, with a final snarl, it disappeared into the trees. Jake's leg was badly injured, a deep gash oozing blood onto the dirt. They couldn't stay. Viggo made the call to leave everything behind, including the campfire. Supporting Jake between them, they moved as quickly as they could, sticking to narrow trails to avoid open spaces. The journey through the forest was harrowing. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent shivers down Viggo's spine. He thought about his family, his mother's laugh when she'd tease him for his meticulous fishing gear, his dad's patient instructions on how to gut a trout. Those moments felt like another lifetime. As the night stretched on, they heard it again. Heavy footsteps, too deliberate to be an animal. The creature was following them, toying with them. Viggo whispered for everyone to stay silent. They moved in single file, Jake leaning heavily on Emily and grimacing with every step. Hours passed before they reached the edge of the forest. The first light of dawn painted the trees in shades of gray and gold. Ahead, the faint outline of a road came into view. They stumbled onto the asphalt, just as a pickup truck crested the hill. The driver slammed on the brakes, his eyes wide with alarm as he took in their bloodied and exhausted forms. They never explained what happened to the driver, just begged him to take them to the nearest town. By the time they reached safety, Jake was barely conscious and the others were too shaken to speak. Viggo never returned to Bladenboro, and he never told anyone outside the group about what they saw. But late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and the smell of blood in the air. The beast of Bladenboro was real, and it was still out there. The drive up to Maine had been uneventful, the kind of trip Michael Evans enjoyed. An ambulance driver by profession, he was accustomed to chaos, and the promise of peace, even if shared with strangers, had lured him into booking the organized winter tour. Michael's dog, Cooper, a scrappy mutt with boundless energy, sat at his side, watching the road like he could sense the turn of fate ahead. Michael hailed from Salt Lake City, a city bordered by craggy mountains and long desert highways. On weekends, he hiked to clear his mind, a habit born from years of navigating life and death moments in the back of an ambulance. The white slopes of Maine, draped in fog and rain, felt far from home but somehow fitting. The group, a mix of tourists and enthusiasts, was here to explore the wooded wilderness near Bar Harbor for a day before retreating to the warmth of civilization. The rain started as a drizzle, dotting the frozen ground with shallow puddles. By the time they reached the campsite, nestled deep in the forest, it had become a persistent shower, soaking the dead leaves and dark soil. The tour guide, a middle-aged man with an authoritative air, told them the rain was typical for Maine winters. "Keeps the woods quiet," he said with a grin, though the quietness was unsettling rather than comforting. That evening, they gathered around a fire hastily built under a tarp. The flames sputtered and hissed in protest against the rain. Conversation buzzed about local legends, bear encounters, mountain lions, and the whispers of something older. One of the tourists, a woman with a flair for drama, mentioned stories of creatures that mimicked voices and shapes. Michael dismissed it as harmless storytelling, the kind people use to make their vacations feel exciting. Cooper barked, snapping Michael from his thoughts. The dog had been staring at the dark tree line, his ears pinned back, growling low. It wasn't unusual for dogs to get jittery in the woods, but something about Cooper's unease made Michael's skin crawl. He grabbed a flashlight and swept it toward the forest. The beam illuminated gnarled branches and rain-slicked bark, but nothing moved. The guide suggested they turn in early since the rain showed no signs of stopping. Michael volunteered for the first watch, a precautionary measure against wildlife, and stayed near the fire with Cooper curled at his feet. The woods seemed endless, the rain muting distant sounds into an eerie, watery symphony. His flashlight occasionally caught shapes in the shadows, but they always turned out to be stumps or hanging moss, until they weren't. It started as a flicker, a movement too deliberate to be the wind. Michael tensed, the light of his fire suddenly feeling too small. Cooper's growl deepened, more urgent now. Michael turned the flashlight back toward the forest, and there it was, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. It looked human, but wrong. Its stance unnaturally rigid, its head tilted too far to one side. Michael called out, his voice shaking despite himself. "Hey, are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it mimicked his words, a perfect echo, but without emotion. The group stirred awake as Michael stepped back toward them, his knife now in hand. The figure stepped closer, revealing features that made Michael's stomach churn. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, and its eyes were hollow pits reflecting the firelight. Then it smiled, a wide, if grotesque grin that showed far too many teeth. Panic erupted. The creature lunged, its speed unnatural, claws glinting like shards of obsidian. The guide tried to intervene, swinging a hatchet, but the creature moved too quickly, slashing his chest open with a sickening sound. The man collapsed, blood pooling in the mud. Michael shouted for the group to run, grabbing Cooper's leash as he bolted toward the trail. The rain turned the ground into a slick mess, their boots slipping as they fled through the maze of trees. The creature's shrieks followed them, echoing unnervingly like the cries of the injured guide. It wasn't chasing outright, but stalking, its footsteps deliberate and terrifyingly close. Michael's mind raced, recalling snatches of what the dramatic tourist had said, legends of skinwalkers, shape-shifting beings from Navajo lore. He didn't know much about them, but he remembered they were dangerous, cunning predators that hunted with malevolent intent. They pressed on, desperate and disoriented, losing 2 members of the group to the creature's swift, brutal attacks. Michael didn't look back, focusing only on the path ahead. His flashlight flickered, the batteries weakened by the damp, but he kept moving. The forest began to thin, revealing hints of the road beyond. Relief surged as they stumbled onto the asphalt, their breaths ragged and eyes wild. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, the rumble of an engine breaking the suffocating silence. Michael waved frantically, and the car slowed, a pickup truck driven by a startled local. They piled in, Cooper barking hysterically as the truck sped off toward the nearest town. Michael sat in the truck bed, cradling Cooper as he stared back at the woods. The rain blurred the shapes, but he swore he saw the creature watching, its hollow eyes reflecting the truck's taillights. When they reached safety, Michael couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. The survivors were too shaken to confirm anything, and the local authorities dismissed it as a bear attack. But Michael knew the truth, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood, and some places, like the rain-drenched forests of Maine, are better left undisturbed. I've worked hard my whole life. Simple stuff, nothing glamorous, just enough to get by and keep things steady. That's why, when the chance to join a weekend trip through the backwoods of Michigan came up, I thought, why not? I don't take many breaks, and the thought of a couple of days away from the grind, meeting new people, sounded like a welcome change. The travel agency promised a scenic, guided tour, complete with campfire dinners and walks through some of Michigan's most remote and beautiful areas. It seemed like just the thing I needed. My name's Viggo Reeves. I'm from Wichita, a city that runs on hardworking folks like me. It's flat out there, the kind of place where horizons stretch forever and the sound of freight trains becomes a lullaby. When I wasn't at my job or working on side projects, I was usually at my buddy's place, rolling dice over a Warhammer 40K board, losing myself in battles between armies of miniature soldiers. It's not something I advertise to strangers, but it's a decent way to unwind. Out here in Michigan, though, there wasn't much to roll dice about. Just endless forest, scattered sunshine filtering through the treetops, and a van full of strangers. We were about halfway through the first day when things started going wrong. The tour van shuddered once, twice, then gave up completely. We coasted to a stop on a dirt road, miles from anything resembling civilization. The driver, a gruff, older man who looked like he'd seen 100 roadside breakdowns, muttered a string of curses and told us to sit tight. He'd call for help, but out here, cell service was more dream than reality. The group decided to pass the time by setting up camp. There was no point in staying cooped up in the van. It was sunny, but there was a crispness in the air that warned the season hadn't fully committed to spring yet. We built a fire near the edge of the woods, joking about how we'd just turned a guided tour into a survival adventure. The sun dipped lower as the hours passed, casting long shadows across the road. That's when Cooper, a sharp-eyed hiker from the group, noticed something odd. "Hey, anyone else hear that?" he said, cocking his head toward the woods. At first, we all dismissed it as wind rustling the branches, but then it came again. A low, guttural sound. Not a growl, not exactly, but something that didn't fit. The guide, trying to keep everyone calm, said it was probably just a coyote. "They're common around here," he assured us. "But I've heard coyotes back home, and this didn't sound like one." The firelight danced against the trunks of the trees as the sound grew closer. I gripped my pocket knife instinctively, wishing I had something more substantial. Then we saw it, or at least part of it. A shadow, long and distorted, moved just beyond the fire's reach. It was too big to be a deer, and the way it moved was wrong. Its steps were jerky, unnatural, like it didn't know how to walk properly. "Stay here," the guide said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the woods. We watched him disappear into the dark, the beam of his light bobbing along. He didn't come back. Minutes passed like hours. We called his name, but the only answer was the sound again, louder this time. Then, out of the shadows, something crawled, or slithered. It was hard to tell. It looked human at first, but its proportions were off. Arms too long, legs too thin, skin stretched tight over its frame. The firelight caught its eyes, hollow and black, like two pits sucking in the light. Chaos erupted. Someone screamed, and the creature lunged, dragging one of the tourists into the dark with a guttural snarl. The rest of us ran. We grabbed what we could, bags, knives, whatever was within reach, and bolted into the woods. The fire still burned behind us, casting flickering shadows that made it hard to tell what was real. We stumbled through the trees, the undergrowth clawing at our clothes. I heard something behind us, heavy footsteps, twigs snapping. The creature wasn't chasing us, it was stalking, herding us like prey. It mimicked the cries of the person it had taken, its voice distorted and wrong, sending shivers down my spine. We spent the night huddled together in a hollow beneath a fallen tree. No one spoke much, just whispered prayers and muffled sobs. I thought about the stories I'd heard, the ones people told about shapeshifters and spirits in these woods. I never believed them before, but now they felt too close for comfort. At dawn, the creature came again, its distorted form visible through the mist. We ran, every man and woman for themselves. A few didn't make it. I don't like to think about what happened to them. Eventually, we found a road. A real road, not the dirt trail we'd started on. A trucker stopped when he saw us, his face pale as we climbed into the cab. He didn't ask questions, just drove until the forest was far behind. Back in town, we told the authorities, but they didn't believe us. They said it was a bear or maybe a wolf, but we knew better. Whatever was out there wasn't natural. It wasn't an animal. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong. I still hear the sounds sometimes, low, guttural, echoing in my dreams, and I know I'll never step foot in those woods again.